welcome everybody today to our First Amendment celebration at California State University, Fresno. My name is Kathy Adams, and I'm a professor of communication and chair of mass communication and journalism. And I would like to welcome everybody here, get us going on this great event. And I'd like to point out that for me, one of the reasons I'm so delighted with this event is because this is why universities exist. We're here to work with the community, our students, and our faculty, and we don't need to be mandated to do so. We enjoy doing so. And let me be the first person to thank the Fresno Regional Foundation and the Fresno Bee who came to us and wanted us to do something like this. We said, well, sure. And Betsy and I worked with other colleagues. Let's bring this department in. Let's bring these students in. And I'd like to point out that the students have organized this and are participating in it, and are here also as audience members as we roll out throughout the day. So without any further ado, and getting some of our most important people up here, I would like to introduce you to Betsy Hayes, who is the person who coordinated all of this. She is our, of course, faculty person. When you ask, can we do this? She always says, of course we can. And this is what happens when that occurs. And she will roll out some other thank yous and bring you up to date on some other things that we are doing. And thank you again, Professor Hayes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. Yes, I am one of the co-chairs of the event today, but I am a co-chair, and so I do want to acknowledge my student, Veronique Wirtz. She is a public relations senior graduating in May, and she worked very, very hard to also put this event together, so shout out to Veronique. Thank you very much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jim Boren. Jim is the executive editor and senior vice president of the Fresno Bee. And as Kathy mentioned, we would not be here today without Jim. It was his vision to pull in the mass communication and journalism department and the regional foundation and the comm department and the Maddie Institute all together in order to celebrate the First Amendment. And that's what we're here to do today. So my dear, dear friend, who is a journalist and a just spectacular human being, Jim Boren.
Well, thank you. I want to add my thanks for your willingness to participate in this First Amendment celebration, and I think we have a great program for you. When Dan DeSantis of the Fresno Regional Foundation first approached me about the possibility of this event, I knew two things. The Fresno Bee should be involved, and it should be at Fresno State. The next step was easy. Get Betsy Hayes, the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, involved, and they would pull the resources together to make it work, and they've done that. We have some great speakers today, and I'm sure you'll leave today with a greater appreciation of the First Amendment and the 5 freedoms that it represents, that it guarantees, actually. So thank you for coming out today. Your presence is a personal statement of the importance you place in the First Amendment. Our freedoms are under fire from government officials who snoop on us and are committed to limiting public access to government. Many even would do away with the First Amendment if they had their way. But that won't happen with a well-informed citizenry. So enjoy the day, and thank you for coming out.
And now we're going to hear a few words from the wonderful Dan DeSantis, the executive director of the Fresno Regional Foundation. And again, it was Dan's vision that brought us here today. And so we are so grateful for you and your wonderful organization. Dan DeSantis.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Adams said this is something that a university should be doing. A lot of people don't understand community foundations. They think of community foundations as that organization who gives money away to nonprofits. They think further and they realize, where does that money come from? It comes from donors, philanthropists in the community who want to support their community. And one of our great donors and philanthropists that we've had in this community was James McClatchy. And he wanted to support both this community and the Sacramento community more than ever. He had passions for the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and for English language learners. And one of his legacies was to leave a gift to us, the Fresno Regional Foundation, on a regular basis through his family foundation that he set up, the Central Valley Foundation. And each year we get a small gift, and we're asked to re-grant it to the community. When it came this year, I had the idea this is the perfect time to talk about the First Amendment, to educate the community more than just giving to a nonprofit, but to give a gift to the entire community. And so we're very pleased to make this grant. We thank the Fresno Bee and Fresno State for supporting us and helping this come true, and we're very pleased to be here. Thank you.
And, because we really want you to feel welcome, we also have a wonderful special guest. As you know, Fresno State was blessed to get a new president this year. And so I have the honor of introducing the amazing Dr. Joseph I. Castro, president of this wonderful bastion of free speech and prudent carrier of the torch of the First Amendment celebration, our president.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you to celebrate this very important occasion. The First Amendment, very important to all of us. I was running a little late this morning because we were working on our new tablet initiative, which I see connected to this whole area and this issue of trying to make sure our students and our faculty have access to all of the information that they need to do their jobs. And part of their job is to question, to raise issues and concerns. I want to express my thanks to the Fresno Regional Foundation for funding and supporting this important event. Thank you, Dan, and to all of your team. And it's always encouraging to see community partners step forward to ensure that important forums like this become a reality. I want to thank the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, the Department of Communication, the Maddie Institute, and the Fresno Bee for their work to present this celebration. They've developed an exceptional lineup for today's program. I think it's especially fitting that a celebration of the First Amendment be held on a university campus where we teach future journalists and we uphold the principles of free speech. And for me as president, that's a very important part of what we do here at the university and something that I'll try to continue and to strengthen in the years to come. I'm not currently a journalist, but I have some experience in this area from high school. I was the editor-in-chief of the Meteor at Hanford High School and a reporter there for a few years before that. And I enjoyed that time so much, and it actually gives me, I think, greater appreciation for the important work that's done in that area than I would have if I had not had that experience. And as the editor-in-chief, I was able to write editorials on different issues and stimulate discussion on the campus about those issues. And I continue to support that important goal for our media here in Fresno and throughout the country. And why is the First Amendment so important? I think it's, as others have said today, it gives people the right to speak freely and to be free from any censorship, gives us the freedom of the press, which allows newspapers to report good things and bad things, and the freedom to worship how we would like. And I think those are all extremely important, and it's amazing that we're able to do this in our society, that we can speak freely and publish freely and worship freely. And I don't take those for granted. I think they're important principles, bedrock for our society, and we should celebrate them as often as we can. So with that, I just want to thank you for including me today in this special celebration, and I look forward to all the great things that happen today, and I hope that we'll be able to celebrate many more times here in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Your program has the lineup for today, And so I want to, encourage you to, look at the insert, read the bios of our amazing keynotes. As you know, we're going to have a live band at lunchtime. We are providing lunch for everybody, so feel free to have coffee and bagels and all of that throughout the morning, and then we'll feed you again in a couple of hours. So we have Doug Fraley, the wonderful chair of the Department of Communication, who's going to get things rolling with our first keynote speaker. Dr. Fraley?
Okay, it's a great day for freedom of speech, and I have the honor of introducing Dr. Craig Smith. And I first met Dr. Smith when I was a debater, and Dr. Smith was a very young assistant professor, and we were at the Georgetown University debate tournament. And it's not the least bit of a surprise that we would meet in Washington, D.C., because much of Dr. Smith's early career centered around our nation's capital. He was a speechwriter for President Ford and also served as a consultant for the first President Bush. He also wrote speeches for Lee Iacocca and had a distinguished career there, after which he was the founder of a Freedom of Expression Foundation, which has moved to Cal State Long Beach about 25 years ago. And for 25 years, Dr. Smith has been the director of the Center for First Amendment Studies there in Long Beach. Dr. Smith is an accomplished, a renowned scholar in the field of freedom of expression. He's published 16 books, presented many scholarly papers. Over the years, I've had many opportunities to be on panels and to attend panels at convention where Dr. Smith has spoken on First Amendment issues. He's really a scholar across the board as a former presidential speechwriter, political communication, and campaign finance are two of the main issues that he's addressed. The most recent time I heard him speak, he was speaking about student free speech rights. But the most important, and I'm delighted about the topic that he'll be speaking to us today on, because when I read Professor Smith's scholarships, one of the things that I find the most interesting is his command of the history of the First Amendment. And I think that understanding the history of the First Amendment is vital to understanding that. Not only has he been a professor and the director for the Center of the First Amendment Studies, he has also been a trustee for the California State University system. He's been given teaching awards as the outstanding professor at Cal State Long Beach. We're just blessed to have such an excellent speaker to serve as our first keynote and kick us off. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Craig Smith.
Are we on? Good. Well, thank you. It's great to be back at Fresno State. It's always been one of my favorite places to visit. President Welty used to take me to the games, and I would be in the president's box up there, and I guess we were allowed to have wine where nobody else was. So that was always fun. My job this morning is to talk about the history of the First Amendment. And it's important to know the history of the First Amendment so that we understand how it was strengthened through each of the crises that the First Amendment faced. Why do we have a First Amendment? When the Constitution was ratified, 2 states ratified the Constitution on the condition that a Bill of Rights be added to it. And so the Constitution was ratified, and then the Congress was told, they put out a call for amendments to the Constitution that would be submitted by various states. The person in charge of gathering all these amendments together and making sense of them was James Madison, who eventually became President of the United States, our shortest and lightest president at 5'4" and 120 pounds. But all that was made up for by his wonderful wife, Dolly, who invented the inaugural ball. Madison took the 200 proposals from the states and combined them together, and then worked through a list to get them down to about 26. It's one of the reasons that there are 5 clauses to the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, and freedom to petition the government for your grievances. So those were 5 different amendments submitted by the states that were pulled together into one. In consultation with the United States Senate, the House of Representatives put together 12 amendments to the Constitution and put them out to the states for ratification. The first 2 were not ratified. The next 10 were. And so the third became the first. And that is the First Amendment that we have today. Ironically, one of those first 2 amendments had no time limit on when it could be ratified. And it was finally ratified as the last amendment to the Constitution that was passed in the 70s. And so it's the one that says Congress can't give itself a raise. It can only give a raise to the next Congress. But it was written by Madison. So James Madison wrote the First Amendment to the Constitution and the last amendment to the Constitution, which I find kind of remarkable and kind of a neat fact that we can deal with. The First Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1791, along with the other 9 that make up the Bill of Rights. These constitute some of our basic rights. They can be traced back to the Magna Carta, such things as a jury by your peers, the right to a fair and swift trial. All of these things are the right to privacy, are all part of the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment hit its first bump in 1796. So only after 5 years was it challenged. And what happened was the United States was involved in a crisis with the government of France. The government of France started interfering with our trade with England because France was at war with England in 1796. The Directory of France was eventually going to be taken over by Napoleon, who became a dictator, and it looked like the United States might go to war with France. In this external crisis, an internal crisis also developed in the United States. Many people began to think that certain French philosophers who came to the United States were subversive and trying to get the United States to become the kind of revolutionary country France was. And so they began to worry about illegal immigrants, of all things, coming into the United States and causing trouble. The crisis got worse under President John Adams. By 1798, the French had sunk or captured 300 American ships. These were ships that were carrying cotton to England. Some of them were armed, some of them weren't, and it looked like we were going to go to war. Alexander Hamilton, the leader of the Federalist Party at the time, decided that legislation was needed to curb some of the problems we were facing. And so the Congress, in this crisis, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of bills and pieces of legislation that were the first to restrict First Amendment freedoms. And they will show up here in a minute when they blank the back screen out. But various parts of this bill made it more difficult to become a United States citizen. They made it more difficult to come to the United States. And they made it much more difficult for private citizens to negotiate for the United States. The Logan Act, which came out of this group of different kinds of legislation, is still in effect to this day. And other parts of the bill are also still in effect to this day. The bill was so, as you can see, rather restrictive that many of the leaders of the United States became concerned with it. The bottom one, the Sedition Act, held that any person combining or conspiring with the intent to oppose any measure or measures of the government of the United States shall be liable to fines up to $5,000 and imprisonment for 5 years. So if you didn't like a piece of legislation and you began to criticize it, you could be locked up. And eventually, many people were. Even a member of Congress was locked up, put in prison, Congressman Lyon, for opposing some of this legislation. He won re-election from his prison cell, thank goodness. The other part of this crisis, which we'll see in other crises, is that the external crisis, the threat of war with France, was used to justify internal controls. And the Federalist Party generated an internal crisis that probably wasn't really there. The people who came from France to propagandize about liberty, equality, and fraternity, the three goals of the French Revolution, were called philosophers. And they came to the United States and they spoke, and many of those spoke against President John Adams, and they were put in jail or exported from the United States. So people began to think about what was going on in the country with all these laws being passed, and Jefferson and Madison stepped forward and said, this isn't right. We don't like what's going on. And they wrote what are called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves, which said that something that's unconstitutional should be resisted by the states. That led to a big clash in the United States between the Federalist Party and the Anti-Federalist Party, between people who were followers of Jefferson and Madison and people who were followers of Alexander Hamilton. And the issue wasn't resolved until the election of 1800. In that election, for the first time, the opposition party won the presidential election. Jefferson became president. And when he was inaugurated, and in those days the inaugurations were in March of the year following the election, in March of 1801, Jefferson was inaugurated, and he allowed all of these acts to lapse. They were sunsetted at the inauguration of the next president and could be renewed by the president or not renewed at his whim. And so Jefferson said these were not going to stay on the books, and so these laws were sunsetted, and Jefferson announced in his inaugural address that we were going to return to the intent of the founders with regard to the First Amendment and restore freedom of expression, freedom of religion to the United States. So the First Amendment survived its first crisis, and in many ways it was strengthened by the crisis that it went through. The next crisis that the First Amendment faced was one that you would expect because of the issue of slavery. In the South, of course, to get southern states to ratify the Constitution allowed for slavery to continue. And in the North, in the 1830s, an abolitionist movement began. This was a movement that was trying to abolish slavery, obviously. It involved, for the first time, many women in politics. And many of the women's associations who opposed slavery used the First Amendment right to petition the government with grievances. They would send their petitions to the House of Representatives, and the former president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, who went back into the House of Representatives after he was president, would get up in the House of Representatives and read the petitions that these women sent saying that slavery should be abolished. He became such a nuisance to his colleagues in the House that they censored him for doing this, but it didn't bother him. He just kept getting up and reading these various petitions. It's interesting to note, as a kind of side note, that it was the women who got involved in the abolitionist movement that eventually got involved in the suffrage movement to give women the vote, which they wouldn't get until 1920, believe it or not. So as these grievances were filed, a newspaper was formed in Boston by a man named William Lloyd Garrison. The newspaper was called The Liberator, and it was an abolitionist newspaper, and it advocated for doing away with slavery. Garrison decided what he wanted to do was mail the newspaper into the South. This led to some rioting in the South, and certain states prohibiting the newspaper from coming into the South, which was a violation of the First Amendment. President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, who was from Tennessee, did not want trouble in his administration, and so he supported the barring of these newspapers from going into the South. But the courts sided with William Lloyd Garrison and said, under the First Amendment, these newspapers should be allowed to go into the South. So Senator John C. Calhoun tried to pass legislation that would prohibit the newspapers from going into the South. That failed. And so Andrew Jackson said to his Postmaster General, Amos Kendall, don't mail those papers into the South. And the Postmaster General, acting on his own, prohibited the papers from going into the South. And so the First Amendment was violated by the Postmaster General of the United States, and complicit in that was the President of the United States at the same time. Eventually, of course, this all got resolved in the Civil War. Slavery was abolished. Black men were given the vote. And when black men were given the vote, women protested and said, hey, what about us? We've been here a long time. we were leading the abolitionist fight. Please give us the vote. And they didn't get it. And so this is when the suffrage movement really took off, right after the Civil War. And as I said before, it took them until 1920 to get an amendment to the Constitution allowing women to vote. During the Civil War, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, said that his main goal was to preserve the Union. A little-known fact about Lincoln is when he was elected with about 42% of the vote, but enough in the Electoral College to become president, he would not take office until March of 1861. Inaugurals were in March, as I said, in those days. By the time he stood up to take the oath of office in 1861, 7 states had already seceded from the Union. And so Lincoln was in a very difficult position. His position was that this was a rebellion, that they had no right to secede, because the Constitution was formed by the people. It begins, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And so as far as Lincoln was concerned, the most important thing for him to do was preserve the Union. His shift to ending slavery didn't occur until 1863. It was after they had won the battle at Antietam and it looked like the North was going to win the war that he made that a goal, but it wasn't an initial goal. His initial goal was to preserve the Union. And in order to preserve the Union, Lincoln at times had to suspend habeas corpus. Now, what does that mean? Habeas corpus is the body of law that protects you out of the Bill of Rights. So it's your First Amendment rights, your right to a fair and free trial, jury of your peers, right to privacy, so on and so forth. In war zones, the president said, I have the power to suspend habeas corpus in order to protect the Union. And one of the first places where he suspended habeas corpus was in Maryland, because the Maryland legislature was trying to come into session so that they could secede from the Union. And Lincoln prevented them from doing that, which kept Maryland as a border state rather than having it secede. You can imagine, if you know your geography, Maryland is north of the capital, and therefore the capital would have been surrounded by Confederate states. If Maryland had seceded, capital probably would have had to evacuate to Philadelphia. So Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in that case and in certain other places. One of the first cases to come before the court was in the case of a civilian, a man named Milliken, who criticized the government, criticized Lincoln, and criticized the conduct of the war. He was brought to trial in a military tribunal because in the area where he was operating in Indiana, habeas corpus had been suspended. The case tried to get to the Supreme Court, but not enough members of the Supreme Court supported the case to bring it before the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, said that the case was illegal, that the man was a civilian, that he should have had civilian rights, and he should have been tried in a civilian court. But that got nowhere, in this case, ex parte Milliken, because Taney couldn't get a majority of the court together to rule with him. That's kind of interesting because it was Taney who was from Maryland, by the way, and had owned slaves at one point. Taney, as the Supreme Court Justice, had ruled in the Dred Scott case that slaves were property and should be returned to their owners. Lincoln used that decision of 1857 to springboard his candidacy in 1858 for the United States Senate, which he lost to Stephen A. Douglas. So Lincoln and Taney were enemies going back to 1857, and here they were in 1861 fighting again with one another over whether the president had the right to suspend habeas corpus. There were several other incidents that occurred during the war, and then, as you know, the war ended in 1865, and Lincoln was assassinated. One of the cases then that was still on the books was a case of a man named Milligan. And the Milligan case was taken up by the Supreme Court. This is an important ruling because it's in effect to this day. And what Justice Davis said, and he had been a law partner of Lincoln's, and that's why he was put on the Supreme Court, the Milligan case, which is different than the Milliken case, arrived at the Supreme Court in April of 1866, almost exactly a year after the assassination. And Justice Davis wrote the majority opinion, and it is still the precedent to this day. And I think we need to look at this when we talk about court cases involving prisoners in Guantanamo, when we arrest people overseas and bring them to military tribunals, and when we do that in the United States. And Davis ruled that during the late wicked rebellion, the temper of the times did not allow that calmness in deliberation and discussion so necessary to a correct conclusion of a purely judicial question. Then, considerations of safety were mingled with exercise of power, and feelings and interests prevailed which are happily terminated. Now that the public safety is assured, this question, as well as all others, can be discussed and decided without passion or the admixture of any element not required to form a legal judgment. The Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people, equally in war and in peace, and covers with the shield of its protection all classes of men, at all times, under all circumstances. One of the plainest constitutional provisions was infringed when Milligan was tried by a court not ordained and established by Congress and not composed of judges. Another guarantee of freedom was broken when Milligan was denied a trial by jury. Martial law cannot arise from a threatened invasion. The necessity must be actual and present, and the invasion real. It is difficult to see how the safety of the country required martial law in Indiana. Martial law can never exist where the courts are open and in the proper and unobstructed exercise of their jurisdiction. So, the Constitution says that people who are in the United States, it does not say citizens, it says people who are in the United States have the right to habeas corpus when there's no threat of war in the immediate area. So you don't even have to be a citizen of the United States to be able to have your rights defended in the civil courts. That gets violated every once in a while by a president or two, and we need to be on guard and go back to Justice Davis' ruling, because that is the precedent that's in effect to this day. In other words, Taney was right and Lincoln was wrong, and it took Justice Davis, Lincoln's colleague, to make that a reality. So after the Civil War, there were more challenges to the First Amendment, but it seems every time that the First Amendment survived one of these crises, it came out stronger. The next challenge to the First Amendment rights of people came with the formation of labor unions. In the 1880s, after a number of depressions, where they called them panics in those days, where prices fell and farms were wiped out, people began to demand certain rights. And one of the things that came out of these crises was the union movement. Mr. Gompers led the American Federation of Labor, and there were a lot of unions decided that the best way to reinforce their message was either to go on strike or to participate in protests. And very often, police would shut down those protests, and the protesters would argue that their First Amendment rights had been violated. The words of the First Amendment that apply here are very important. They say you have the right to assemble peaceably. And so if you're unruly, your protest can be broken up. But if your protest is peaceable, the police should not break it up. The police had other ways of operating, of course, and this affected the suffrage movement also. The police could decide, well, we're not going to break you up, but we're not going to protect you either. And suffragists who marched in Washington, D.C., were often attacked by crowds. These women would be spit upon, some of them were beaten, some of them were dragged to the ground, and the police would stand back and do nothing. The same thing happened to union protesters. And so just because the First Amendment protects you doesn't mean that the police will. And that becomes something of a problem when you're trying to advance a cause. With the coming of another war, World War I, the First Amendment faced another challenge. And it's interesting that this challenge would come to the First Amendment from a president who was supposed to be a civil libertarian. The President of the United States was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was elected in 1912 because the Republican Party divided between the moderate wing and the conservative wing. Sounds odd, doesn't it? How could that possibly happen? The sitting president, in contrast to James Madison, William Howard Taft was our heaviest president at 350 pounds. They had to get a new bathtub for the White House for him and make sure it was on the ground floor. And he had been handpicked by his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, to succeed him. But Taft turned out to be too much in the pocket of big business for Teddy Roosevelt, and so Teddy Roosevelt decided to come back and try and get the nomination for himself. The Republican Party decided to go with the sitting president, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt formed his own party, the Progressive Bull Moose Party, and they split the vote, and the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, won with 42% of the vote, became President of the United States. Wilson had pledged to keep us out of war, and in 1914, when World War I broke out in Europe, Wilson did everything he could to avoid us getting involved in the war. In 1915, when one of our ocean liners was torpedoed and sunk, he still just protested, and we did not go to war. But by 1917, things had taken so many turns for the worst that he could no longer stay out of the war, and so in April of 1917, he asked Congress to declare war on Germany, and the United States joined the Allies in World War I. In that same year, in 1917, there was a revolution in Russia, and the Tsar was overthrown, the communists eventually came to power, and the fear of the spread of communism in the United States in 1917 was very like the same fear we faced of the French Revolution, which I talked about earlier, from 1796-98. And so began an examination of what people were doing in the United States and what they were angling for. One of the things that made the external threat into an internal threat it always has fascinated me. The Attorney General was named A. Mitchell Palmer, and he lived in Georgetown, which is a little suburb of Washington, D.C., where I first met Doug Fraley. The university, Georgetown University, is there. A. Mitchell Palmer's house was blown up by anarchists or communists. We've never determined which ones. Luckily, A. Mitchell Palmer and his family were not in the house at the time. But you can imagine what would happen if the current Attorney General's house was blown up in Washington, D.C., and how people would be arrested and how this would verify that there was an internal threat as well as an external threat to the United States. Across the street from A. Mitchell Palmer lived a young man with his family. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. His name was Franklin Roosevelt. And he ran out into the street, this was before he was stricken with polio, and checked out what was going on. A young man who worked as a clerk at the FBI happened to be going by on a bicycle at the time. And he joined the group that were looking at A. Mitchell Palmer's house and figuring out what had happened. That young man on the bicycle was J. Edgar Hoover. And so this explosion in 1918 brought all these people together. So again, we passed laws to try and stop internal subversion from taking place all throughout the end of World War I and going forward into 1919 and 1920. What would happen with these laws? Woodrow Wilson and his Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, went back to the laws that were passed in 1798 during the Alien and Sedition Crisis, the laws that I put up there before. So we had new alien laws, we restricted immigration, the president was allowed to deport people, the president was allowed to decide who could come. If they were not citizens of the United States, he could prohibit them from visiting the United States. That's still a law to this day. We tried to prohibit Yasser Arafat from speaking at the United Nations at one point, the President of the United States, and used the authority of these laws that are still on the books from Woodrow Wilson's era. Lots of people were incarcerated for advocating the overthrow of the government. The courts ruled that that was illegal, that the president had a right during wartime to not allow people to do that kind of activity. Eventually, these cases made it to the Supreme Court after the war was over. So Woodrow Wilson, who had a stroke and could not run for re-election, the Democratic Party ran a man named Cox, who ran with his vice president, Franklin Roosevelt. They lost the election to Senator Harding of Ohio. The Republicans called for a return to normalcy. It was the Republicans that gave women the vote, and which is, for some of you, might seem ironic, but the first woman governor was a Republican. The first woman senator was a Republican. The first woman member of the House of Representatives was a Republican. The first Supreme Court justice that was a woman was a Republican. We've come a long way, baby. In 1920, some of these laws were repealed, but the way that most of them were repealed was that we went to the Supreme Court and we got rulings that are important and in effect to this day. The most important case to come before the courts was the case of Abrams. This was a man who advocated resisting the war. He was a pacifist. He said you shouldn't go fight in the war, and he was put in jail. And his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they freed him, arguing that these pronunciamentos in no way attacked the form of government of the United States. They're talking about the manifestos that Abrams put out. I do not see how anyone can find the intent required by the statute in any of the defendant's works. In this case, sentences of 20 years imprisonment have been imposed for the publishing of 2 leaflets that I believe the defendant had as much right to publish as the government has to publish the Constitution. The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. The United States, through many years, has shown its repentance for the Sedition Act of 1798 by repaying fines that it imposed. And so the court said, you were wrong in 1798 to put these laws on the books, and you're wrong now to have these laws on the books. And Justice Holmes, in another decision, said that you can't put somebody in jail unless they present a clear and present danger to the government or to other individuals. And this has been reinforced through various rulings of the Supreme Court. Well, you'd think that would have solved the issue, but no. Things got dicey again after World War II. And once again, it involved the Soviet Union. What happened? In 1945, the war ended. Germany was defeated in April, and in August, Japan was defeated. One of our allies was the Soviet Union in that war. They had fought on the eastern side of Germany. In 1946, by 1946, the Soviet Union was so paranoid about what had happened to it and the number of people it lost in World War II that it decided it was going to exercise its sphere of influence over Eastern Europe and start taking over these countries that were on its border so that it would have a buffer against the West in the future. Winston Churchill, who had been the Prime Minister of England during the war, was invited to the United States by President Harry Truman. And he came to Westminster College in Missouri, and he gave a speech. And in that speech, Winston Churchill said that an iron curtain had descended across Europe from the Baltic down to the Adriatic. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. Suddenly, we were no longer happy with the Soviet Union as an ally. Now, in the 30s, many people in this country during the Depression, when almost a third of the workforce was unemployed, had joined the Communist Party. This was not seen as a good thing until the Soviet Union became an ally of ours in World War II, and then people could be more out about being in the Communist Party. But when the Soviet Union became an enemy again in the Cold War, taking over these countries in Eastern Europe, people who had been members of the Communist Party were seen as subversive in the United States. And a number of events then developed the external threat of the Soviet Union again into an internal threat of subversion, which justified the government, according to the government, of course, suppressing these people and jailing some of them. Consider the sequence of events. 1946, 1947, the Soviet Union takes over Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland. They control Eastern Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. They try to take Yugoslavia, but they fail there. They take Romania, and they're threatening Macedonia and Greece. So this Iron Curtain becomes a reality. In light of that, President Truman required all government employees to take a loyalty oath to the United States. And many states followed, including the state of California. If you were a government employee and you wanted to work, you had to take a loyalty oath to the state of California and to the United States government. And that included professors. And professors that did not take that oath were fired, even if they had tenure. So tenure isn't all it's cracked up to be. Just remember that. The next thing that happened in 1948 was that the editor-in-chief of Time magazine came before the House Un-American Activities Committee and claimed that the Undersecretary of State had been a member of a communist cell with him. His name was Whittaker Chambers, and the Undersecretary of State was named Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss had been one of the architects of the United Nations. Alger Hiss had been with the president at Yalta when we negotiated with the Soviet Union over the end of World War II. So Hiss was called before the Un-American Activities Committee, and he was questioned by a new young congressman named Richard Nixon. And Nixon asked Hiss if he'd ever been a member of the Communist Party, and Hiss said, "That's ridiculous. How could that possibly be? I'm the Undersecretary of State," so on and so forth. That night, after the first day of testimony, Nixon went back to his hotel room and looked at the testimony of Alger Hiss and noticed that he had never denied being a member of the Communist Party. He just laughed off the question. So the next morning, Nixon came at Hiss again, and Hiss began to evade the question. And Nixon said, "Look, you can answer yes or no. Were you ever a member of the Communist Party?" And Alger Hiss said, "I am not now, nor have I ever been a member of the Communist Party." And he was convicted of perjury a few years later. He had been a member of a cell, and it turns out that the FBI discovered that his wife's typewriter had been used to transmit documents to the Soviet Union. Everyone who's tried to exonerate Hiss, because Hiss claimed to his dying day that he was innocent, everyone who's tried to exonerate him has been converted by the evidence that Hiss was actually guilty. So people began to develop a paranoia in the United States. I mean, imagine if the Undersecretary of State was found to be a former member of the Communist Party. Things went from bad to worse in 1949. China fell to the communists under Mao Zedong. The Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb. How did they get the technology to explode an atomic bomb? Many people thought it had to come from the United States, and in fact, it was determined that certain people working at Los Alamos had leaked secrets to the Soviet Union. So for the United States, the people of the United States, this became rather confusing. How was it that we had won World War II, and then all of a sudden, half of Europe had fallen to the Soviet Union, China had fallen, and now the Soviet Union had the atom bomb? There had to be some explanation, and the simpler the explanation, the better, and the explanation was there had to be internal subversion. In 1950, a new senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy, gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he claimed that he had a list of 205 subversives in the State Department, and he waved the list at the audience. Ironically, it was a women's Republican club. We get back to the suffragists again. It turned out that what McCarthy actually waved at the audience was his laundry list from his hotel room. He had no names. He just made it up. But he went on a 4-year tear that led to libraries pulling books off the shelf that were by Marx or talked about the Soviet Union. It led to American embassies in Europe burning books from their own libraries. It led to suppressive laws. There were laws passed that said you could not advocate the overthrow of the United States government, the Smith Act. Eugene Dennis was the secretary of the Communist Party in America, and he was arrested and put in jail for advocating the overthrow of the government of the United States. The Dennis case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it came up during this McCarthy era, during this time of paranoia. And Dennis, the conviction of Dennis was upheld by the Supreme Court. So once again, when we're threatened externally, the Supreme Court tends to chill our rights. Later, when when McCarthy was shown to be a fraud and was condemned by the United States Senate in 1954, things began to return to normal again. And so another man named Yates, who was a member of the Communist Party, was incarcerated, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1957, the Supreme Court said, we were wrong in the Dennis case. You can advocate the overthrow of the government of the United States as long as you don't really threaten. You have a right to say whatever you want. And so our rights were restored in the Yates case in 1957. So what I've tried to portray in looking at the crises that the Supreme Court, that the United States has faced with regard to the First Amendment, is that the pattern that is here is one we need to watch out for in the future. And that pattern is, when we have an external threat, we tend to shrink our rights in the name of national security. We've seen this most recently with 9/11. And the corresponding part of that is when we have the external threat, some people use that to say that there's also an internal threat of subversion, and more rights get reduced. And we can look at this pattern through the examples I gave, and we can see who's been involved in these and who hasn't been involved in these in terms of the government. So if you start with the Alien and Sedition Act, you can see that the external threat was the quasi-war with France. This was converted into an internal threat, saying that the Jacobins and the Philosophes were a real threat. The major actor in this case was the Congress. It passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Supreme Court never ruled on them. It took no part. In the Civil War, the threat was secession, states pulling out. The threats were people called the Copperheads. These were people in the North that advocated for Southern rights and for the right to secede, and they were often put in jail. The major actor in this case was President Lincoln. He suspended habeas corpus and allowed for the jailing of editors of various newspapers. And the Supreme Court got involved. Finally, at the end, Taney tried to get involved and couldn't get on the court. And then the court ruled in the Milligan case, after Lincoln was dead in 1867, that many of these laws and the suspension of habeas corpus was incorrect. During World War I, the external threat was Germany and communism. Anarchists and commies and Reds in the United States were arrested after the bombing of the house of A. Mitchell Palmer. The major actor was the President of the United States. And the laws that were passed were the Espionage Act and the Trading with the Enemies Act. Those were finally overruled by the Supreme Court in the Schenck and Abrams cases. In the McCarthy case, the Soviet Union was the external threat. Subversives, commies, and pinks in the United States were the internal threat. The major actor was the Congress, passing laws that forbade advocating the overthrow of the government. The McCarran-Walters Act, blacklisting of people who had been members of the Communist Party in Hollywood. Many people didn't work for years because they had been associated with people who were in the Communist Party. And then we had the Dennis case, which upheld these laws in 1954, and the Yates case in 57, which eventually overturned them. So the threat to the First Amendment can come from the president, it can come from the Supreme Court by its being complicit in what's going on, it can come from the Congress. So we need to be ever vigilant that our government is doing the right thing. Most recently, of course, we faced the crisis of 9/11, and the laws that were passed there allowed for many things that we saw that were outlawed in 1798 during the Alien Sedition Crisis and in World War I during the crisis over the Red Scare with A. Mitchell Palmer and Woodrow Wilson. Some of these laws have been sunsetted, some of them have been strengthened, but it seems to me that we're always under a threat of some sort from various agencies of the government, the Congress itself, which is supposed to represent us, and even the Supreme Court. When the United States is at risk, the Supreme Court seems to uphold and go along with these security measures. So what we have to do is be vigilant. McClatchy newspapers, which I've worked with in the past when I was president of the Freedom of Expression Foundation in Washington, D.C., has been heroic in these efforts. Other newspapers have also been heroic in protecting our rights over time, and we need to support these efforts and be as vigilant as possible. Thomas Jefferson said that a democracy cannot work unless people are educated. And we know that people can't get educated unless they have credible news sources. One of the most serious problems we face is the confusion in the public about what a credible news source is. We have zillions of cable channels out there that are available to us. You can find some knucklehead who will say anything on one of those channels somewhere that will reinforce the most ridiculous positions of anybody. And so one of the things that's going on in America is people are becoming balkanized. They're watching only the programs that support their point of view. They're watching only programs that reinforce their own ignorance. And the country is becoming more and more divided, less educated in responsible ways, and therefore steps further and further away from Thomas Jefferson's dream of an educated public that can make democracy work. So we've got a lot of work on our hands to do. We can't sit on our campuses where we are educated. We've got to get off the campuses and out into the community and inform people of their First Amendment rights, let them know about the history of the First Amendment, let them know that they need to be suspicious about government activity that tends to suppress or hold back their rights. And so I'm delighted to have been part of this conference and to have helped with the beginning of it here in terms of framing a context for the First Amendment, and I hope the rest of the day is profitable for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you. And now we have our fabulous, award-winning, superstar Fresno State debate team. They're going to get settled up here in just a moment, and then they're going to verbally duke it out. So we're going to have a little 60-second intermission.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank the department as well as the college and chair of the department and all the faculty and staff and other students that support us and our wonderful speaker, Craig Smith. Our topic today is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially curtail criminal liability for the release of classified information to media sources. So our debaters today, on the affirmative, we have Jamila, Ahmed. She's a communications major here. And her partner will be Tom Boroujeni, who is also a communication major. On the negative, we have Nadia Lewis, who is a psychology major. And then we have Aaron Weathers, who is a communication major. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to the debaters. All right.
Okay. In the wake of some of our most revealing leaks in the United States history, it is important for us to examine the policy and effects of these actions on the citizens. Today, we make believe that the United States federal government should substantially curtail criminal liabilities for release of classified information to media sources for two reasons. First, the freedom of speech is an important pillar in our democracy to criminalize the acts that lead to the erosion of rights in our country. There is no democracy without freedom of opinion. United Nations News, Century 13. There can be no democracy without freedom of opinion. A United Nations dependent excerpt said, highlighting the importance of access to information, you should not be subjected to the pressures of intimidating, whether government or by the private sector, which would force you into self-censorship. Alfred says that independent excerpts on the promotion of democracy and equitable international order told the UN News Century following a briefing to journalists in New York, if you censor yourself, you cannot articulate your needs. If you cannot articulate your priorities, then whatever you do, putting a little cross in the ballot box, etc., does not represent your views in the act of desperation, he stressed. One of the problems that we have in the human rights community is that special interests often forget the interests of other victims, and there's competition among victims expressed that is unnecessary. He said, adding also that some victims are viewed as being privileged while others are more excluded. The second reason to reduce the criminal liabilities of people who release classified information into the media is to create a system of sensory checks and balances against the tyranny of government. Indefinite detention, drone strikes on civilians, phone and data tapping shows that we need the citizens of this country to know that the government does what the government does is in their name. Who decides that certain information is classified? The government's power over information leads to corruption because our incriminating information can be classified. Leaks lead to better checks and balances on the systems of power. John says that agents have also released information to media sources in the interview in 13 that President Obama has been unprecedented in the uses of espionage acts to prosecute those who whistleblow. He wants to curtail the purpose of espionage acts. Persecution, however, is not in the punishment of a person by spying for the enemy, selling secrets for personal gain, or trying to undermine our ways of life. It is a ruin of whistleblower, personal, professional, and financially. It is meant to send a message to anyone considering speaking the truth of power. Challenges us, we will destroy you. Challenging us, and we will destroy you. A message to anyone else contributes speaking truth to power. Only 10 people in American history has been charged with espionage for leaking classified information. 7 of them under Barack Obama. The effects of changes in the person's life, being viewed as a traitor, being shunned by the family and friends, incurring massive legal bills is a part of the plan to force the whistleblowing into personal ruins, to weaken him to the point that he will plead guilty to make anything the case go away. I have him no classified information, only the business card of a former CIA colleague who has never been undercover. The other espionage charges was for the same unclassified business card to a reporter for ABC News. All these espionage charges were eventually dropped, so why charge me in the first place? It was not my espionage for whistleblowing the CIA's torture program and confirming the pressure despite government protestation in the contrary, that the U.S. government was indeed in the business of torture at the CIA. Employees are trained to believe that nearly every moral issue is a shade of gray, but this is simply not true. Some issues are black and white, and torture is not one of them. Another problem with the Espionage Act is that it has never been applied uniformly. The only way to end this is to administrate an administration abuse of Espionage Act to rewrite the law. It is important. It is so that it does not even mention classified information. The classification system hadn't yet invented. The law was written in a century ago to prosecute Germans, and only update came in 1950 in the height of Julius and Ethel Rethenbu case. The law is so broad and vague that many legal scholars argue that it is unconstitutional. The attack on the civil liberty of the whistleblowing reports are so far too important to move on off message and to trivialize it. After all, the government is spying on all of us. That should be the story.
And with that, we're open to cross-examination.
Yeah. 2 minutes, yeah.
2 minutes.
All right, thank you. The first question that I'd like to ask is exactly what is freedom of speech?
Freedom of speech is basically allowing people to express their opinion and being able to say what they want to say.
Great.
Speaking
exactly what is
restriction.
an opinion?
What is that?
What do you mean by opinion?
Whatever they need to say to further the right and their anything they need to do to further the democracy of the United States.
Then why is leaking classified information classified as one's opinion?
No, we're saying not only opinions, but you should be able to speak without restriction.
So speak without restriction. I'm completely about conveying one's opinions and having that freedom of speech. What I'm trying to understand is when someone leaks this type of classified information, is that classified as one's opinion?
If it is your opinion that it's the right of the American people to know that information, then yes.
Okay, what is the benefit of American people knowing about drone strikes and all these atrocities that the government is doing?
It's a check on the powers of the United States, because if you don't have checks, citizenry check on the powers of a country, then you lead to tyranny.
We currently know about a lot of drone strikes that have happened abroad, as well as the atrocities that are happening in Guantanamo Bay. Has there been any checks and balances against the American government currently?
Yes, they're changing the policies toward these situations that it came directly from as a result of WikiLeaks and Snowden leaks.
Okay, and also, is it possible when one is leaking this classified information to completely take it out of context?
It's always possible. You know, it depends on the source and the person who takes the information in and deals with the information.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank everyone for coming out today. So we will be presenting the negative position to the resolution. We hold the belief that the United States federal government should not substantially curtail criminal liability for release of classified information to media sources. Hiding behind the guise of freedom of speech and transparency becomes nonsensical in this topic area. Janet Daly at the Treasurer states that we are entering an unprecedented age of free speech, right? For the first time in human history, the state will no longer have control over information, right? Democracy is about to come to its full fruition with the triumph of bottom-up power over top-down domination, right? Wrong. The frenzied hyperbole generated by the latest WikiLeaks episode, an anarchic but so far remarkably ineffectual spasm of delinquency, seems peculiarly weak in its understanding of the basic concepts with which its rhetoric is larded. It is in fact the precise opposite of what its apologists claim it to be. With its unilateral program of revealing confidential information, which it boasts is unstoppable and accountable to no one, it is profoundly anti-democratic. In its self-contradictory maintenance of its own untraceable operation, it effectively declares itself to be the only agency in the world that is entitled to secrecy. Its insistence that it is somehow a voice of open and transparent freedom of expression is simply absurd. There is no issue here of any individual or group openly expressing an opinion that would otherwise have been suppressed. The only opinion that is implicitly conveyed by WikiLeaks exposures is the boringly prosaic anti-Americanism of the average Guardian comment writer. These documents were not given but were stolen. Private conversations disclosed for public consumption, James Faust states. The natural reaction to theft is paranoia about security. If a thief breaks into your home because you left a window unlocked, it is natural to become paranoid about locking every single entrance to your home as a result. In a very real way, WikiLeaks has participated in the theft of classified data. As a result, we can expect the U.S. government to respond by increasing the security around its data regardless of classification. The State Department's withdrawal of NCD from CIPRNet is only one example of how this will function. It is not unreasonable to think that new pieces of analysis or intelligence will be classified at ever higher levels over the top secret networks that are much harder to leak into the public. But classifying information more aggressively so fewer people can read, it is the opposite of transparency. Even information that is perfectly unclassified will probably be transmitted over the higher security networks now. The danger of exposing them to leaking is simply too great. Ashong in 2010 writes, most of us wouldn't speak the same way in front of our boss as we would with our best friend. When world leaders like Ahmadinejad or Hugo Chavez make brazen and inflammatory statements, we take umbrage not only at the content of their comments, but with the accompanying and typically unnecessary bombast. The nature of diplomatic relations is that they require sensitivity in not only what is said, but in how it is said. By breaching the privacy of diplomatic cables, WikiLeaks has comprised the fundamental nature of what diplomats do. They translate the feelings, passions, prejudices, inadequacies, ambitions, and aspirations of real people in positions of power into language that at its best prevents us from blowing each other up. The diplomatic set is arguably a big part of why we don't have more conflict in the world. The saddest thing to me about this latest WikiLeaks disclosure is that it diminishes the value of whistleblowing itself. As I tweeted yesterday, you blow the whistle to spread the truth, not to hear the sound. By publishing these emails, not only has WikiLeaks comprised the privacy of State Department officials and the trust within the important diplomatic networks, It has also undermined its own credibility as a resource for people who have genuinely important information to share with the global community. There is a distinction between truth tellers and high-tech gossip peddlers. Unfortunately, it looks like this time, WikiLeaks has crossed that line too. Open for cross-ex.
And who is the source of that information? Who is the evidence that you were reading? Who is the author of that evidence?
Shang, he is a journalist at the Huffington Post under the politics division.
Okay, so you're saying that basically what WikiLeaks has done is spread this notion of anti-Americanism throughout the world by what they've done. Is that correct?
I think that what we're trying to articulate is that, one, we feel that WikiLeaks is not a problem of freedom of speech necessarily, because we're saying that people can go ahead and convey their own opinion and their perspective on things, but the particular part of releasing classified information is not somebody's own opinion. It's something else that was outside of them. Also,
so you're saying they stole these information and they're sharing it when it's not their own information, basically, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so who owns this information?
Well, it was classified information by the American government.
Who owns the American government?
I would say that the American government doesn't have a ownership.
So you say that people of the United States don't own the American government.
And then the next thing about
No, I don't want to hear the next thing. I want you to answer this question.
Do I think that people own the American government? No, I do not. I think that the American government says that they work for the people, but the American government also doesn't release everything for our own protection.
So it's always a question of protection and security, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm done with cross-examination. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to take about a minute of prep time real quick. Okay, here what the negative team has done is ignored everything we'd say in the affirmative case. We set up two advantages, that the two things that cause this policy to be valuable. One is that freedom of speech is the fundamental right of a pillar of democracy in this country. And if we don't value that, we will lose it. And by the argument they had, one of the arguments is that these systems of release of information hide behind Freedom of Speech Act. But that's not true. In the age of drone strikes, in the age of data mining, in the age of black sites that CIA owns and takes people in and keeps them without any sort of criminal or a civil charge, we need to know about what the government does. Therefore, the argument has no bearing in this debate. They also said that people who release information are not accountable to anybody. but they are accountable to the people of the United States. They do this for the benefit of the people in the United States. Now, the negative team believes that the government of the United States is not owned by the people of the United States. They are this entity that they can do whatever they want and they can benefit from this autonomous standing. But that's not true. We are being governed by the people. The government is for the people, by the people. And that's an important issue we need to take into consideration. They also say that these information are stolen and they don't belong to people. Therefore, it's not their opinion to spread. But that's not true. The information, all the information that is owned by the U.S. government belongs to the American people. And in a world that the people of the United States need to keep their government accountable, therefore they should be able to have access to that information. As Dr. Craig Smith said, and quoted Abraham Lincoln, he said that people cannot get educated unless they have information. And we have been restricting people's information more and more, and therefore they cannot get educated. They also are going to this specific sources of information that furthers their own view and not see the other side. Now, release of information allows for that dissemination of information and allows for a broader spectrum of analysis on the information. They also said that it breaches what diplomacy is supposed to do. The release of information, but diplomacy is supposed to do good things if it's not overreaching its powers. In the age of United States spying on the German counselor and spying on the officials of other countries, that's overreaching and overstepping your boundaries. They also said that the WikiLeaks situation has created a lot of problems. Now, Mr. Paul Harris in 2011 said that the damage caused by WikiLeaks controversy has caused little real and lasting damages to American diplomacy. Senior State Department officials have concluded. It emerged in private briefing to Congress by top diplomats. The fallout of the release of thousands of private diplomatic cables from all over the globe has not been specifically bad. The official implied that the WikiLeaks fiasco was bad public relation, but had little concrete impact on policy. We're told that it was embarrassing, not damaging. Official added, it appears that the damage was localized in terms of few specific cables, for example, about Yemen, and those are expected and containable in the long run. Also, we can see that the public official, including President Obama, is taking action based on those releases. Now, yesterday, this is from yesterday, President Obama said that he will propose new reforms to the National Security Agency aimed at giving Americans more confidence in organizing after various leaks revealed numerous wide-ranging government surveillance programs. And part of, he said, part of what we are trying to do over the next month or so is having done an independent review and brought a whole bunch of folks, civil libertarians and lawyers and others, to examine what has been done. Obama says that these leaks, largely perpetrated by former government contractor Edward Snowden, have identified some areas of legitimate legal consent. So you see that this is an actual checks on the balances of the government. And that they need to be able to answer this question that these leaks have led to solidified, concrete actions, and they can't justify that. I'm open to cross-examination.
You ended that speech, and it was very, very powerful, about saying that these checks and balances have led to concrete actions, correct?
Yes.
Has this actually stopped drone attacks or these atrocities from happening? We just know about them now, correct?
This speech happened yesterday. You can't expect things to, the policy to be spun out of 12-hour news period.
Fair enough.
Do you have any questions about that? No. Straight.
Okay, no further cross-acts? We're going to take just a few seconds of prep. You stop. I apologize. Sorry, I'm coming down with a cold right now. All right. Good morning, everybody. I understand that the negative is taking a position that might be juxtaposed to a lot of public opinion, but what we are trying to say is that curtailing criminal liability on the leaking of classified information is not a breach of one's freedom of speech. I think that the affirmative has completely miscontextualized our argument. Freedom of speech is freedom of opinion. We are not telling one if they can say that drone strikes are good or drone strikes are bad. We're not telling anybody that they can't express their opinion willingly, but what we are telling them is that classified information is not their opinion. Classified information is things that happened that the government felt that might not be beneficial to the American public, and I will get to that later on in my speech. But the problem here is that this is not a breach of freedom of speech. We can still have the American pillar to our democratic society without leaking classified information. We can still have protests against drone strikes. We can still have protests against the atrocities of Guantanamo Bay without leaking this type of information. The reason that we say, one, that this should not information is pulling from a little bit of, from a few good men, you can't handle the truth. The reason that I say that we can't handle the truth is because what happens is we find out, as we've already known, about a lot of the drone strikes and a lot of the atrocities. And what happens is it increases an increased paranoia and distrust of the American government, and then it increases nihilism because we as people feel like there's nothing that we can do. We have protested constantly. We have spoke out to our government. They've promised us things in the past, but historically, they have never delivered. I know that it is an optimistic ideal that Obama has delivered this speech yesterday that we will not have any type of criminal liability against these leaking of classified information. But at the end of the day, I've been promised lots of things in America, and I know you all have too. And have they delivered? No, even though that they say new reforms on agencies, but America still has promised a lot and not delivered. Also, even if we do try to increase this transparency, the American government will create this guise that we are giving you this transparency, we will start locking these things down. But the thing about it is, if you don't know, you just don't know. The American government will then make it much harder to actually get this information to come out to the American public because they're not going to have any criminal liability. They're going to lock down, this is what our false evidence is saying, they are going to lock down the most minute details so that the American public is completely ignorant and knows nothing, less than they know now, because now there is no punishment against leaking this type of classified information. And then lastly, we can take things out of context. When we get these private emails and these private conversations that get leaked to the public does not know the context. I do not know the context because I was not there. And even though I'm leaking this, thinking that this may be completely beneficial to the public, it may have an adverse effect. The adverse effect is that the public feels like they know, but they might not know completely everything that might have happened. If we might have been responding to something that was an attack on us, maybe that there was a potential attack on the American public, and that we were responding to that, but we didn't necessarily need to know the American public they were under. No, you got that. Okay. That the American public was in danger. We've seen what can happen when increased paranoia happens. Think about the anthrax scare. Think about all of these things that have happened in the past. We do not need this unnecessary paranoia, especially when we know that we can't affect here maybe what's happening over there. sometimes we just have to trust our government that they're doing it for the best interest. I know it's not the most preferable idea, but maybe it actually is the best one. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
You said we should trust our government. At the end of your speech, you said we should trust our government to do what's best for us, right?
I will say that trusting, especially because going back to what I said, it's always about this idea of protection and safety in the first cross sex. So I would say it's about them trusting that they're going to try to protect us and keep us safe from bodily harm.
You also said in the middle of your speech that they have promised you a lot of things and they haven't delivered. So which one are we supposed to believe?
They have promised me and delivered me safety and protection, but they have not promised. They've promised a lot of other things to people and they haven't delivered, necessarily meaning that they find things that could be.
So there's a chance that they could deliver.
A chance that they can deliver? They can deliver us safety and protection by keeping doing what they're doing.
That's
by
the
the
only
status
thing
quo.
they can deliver, your safety and protection.
I'm sure there's other things that don't come to mind at this moment, but I will say one thing that they can deliver is a protection and safety protection and safety from abroad attacks, maybe not domestic ones.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, so you were talking about how we can't handle the truth, the American people can't handle the truth?
I'm saying that what happens is when things come out and things become truthful to the American public, there's an increased paranoia and chaos ensues.
So is that true for everyone? What about the people that feel that they have the right to certain knowledge? Should they just live obliviously to the truth?
I will contend that if someone doesn't know something exists, they don't know any difference.
So you're saying that we should close our eyes and not look at the atrocities around the world?
I'm saying that when we do open our eyes and we realize that even though we've already been protesting prior to yesterday's speech, we've been protesting, we've done things in the past, and what happens is when we see America might give us a little bit but not actually give us completely what we desired, and I don't see how these ideas can actually stop these drone attacks, just us knowing stopping the drone attacks or these atrocities, we become nihilistic and lose hope not only in America but our own self-agency.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a little bit of time.
Okay. You're going to be preferring the affirmative position because we endorse WikiLeaks. The negative would prefer that the American people continue to live in oblivious to the things that are going on around us. The negative thinks that the United States citizens are idiots and we should just continue to rely on the propaganda of the news and not take power into our own hands by voicing our opinions and using our freedom of speech, which is our right. Now, they say that the freedom of speech is not the freedom of opinion, but we are saying that that is our right. They say that that classified information does not belong to the American people, but when the United States federal government is owned by we the people, that information, we are privy to that information. So so that is a right of ours to be able to leak information. The American people should know, and by by leaking this information, we continue to make the government have checks and balances, which puts the power back into the American people and lets the government know that we will not go on to living in oblivion and not go on living blindly and ignorantly. Now, the negative endorses this politics of fear by saying that basically we should not know this information because then we'll be paranoid, and they give examples such as like anthrax and things like that. If anthrax is going on around, if people are receiving anthrax letters in the mail, they have the right that there's a possibility that they will get anthrax in their mail. That is our right as the American people. So we need to be able to have our freedom of speech. It's not our freedom of opinion. When we asked in the first cross-ex, we clarified that freedom of speech is the ability to speak without restriction. The negative is trying to put restrictions on our speech, and we say that we have the right to speak and voice whatever information we know and whatever opinions we have. Again, remember that evidence that we gave about how Obama yesterday said that there are currently checks and balances being made by lawyers and by different people in positions of power in the government because of those WikiLeaks that were exposed, and that the information that the American people are now aware of. So, okay, yeah, and then they say that that America is not owned by the people. We say that the Constitution says that we the people, it is owned by the people. So that's probably a good reason why you should prefer the affirmative, because we gain back power for the American people by voicing our opinion. And I think that's it. Oh, and we decrease nihilism because we gain hope by having more information.
You all ready?
What's prep real quick? What? Okay, I'm gonna take prep.
Okay.
Prep real quick. Really understanding where the negative is coming from. They say that we think that the American people should be oblivious. This is not what we're saying. We're saying that we've elected officials in the government, right? People that we trust to handle these situations, these things. So leaking classified information to American citizens who aren't trained to have an understanding of what's going on behind the scenes in the government will lead to a frenzy and paranoia because they don't have a full understanding of what's happening. So we're not saying that the citizens are idiots, but what we are saying is we need to be able to trust our officials to handle these things that we cannot fully understand because it is not in our position. That's why we elected them. And also, basically, by leaking this information, this classified information, is going to cause the government to shut down and decrease the information that we as citizens are able to learn about and know about and have knowledge about. So it's going to have adverse effects. It's not going to give the citizens more knowledge. It's just going to cause the government to become less open to us, and we're going to have even less knowledge. There's no way that the government is just going to let these leaks happen without putting a shutdown and stopping these people from doing these things. Freedom of speech is, like the affirmative says, the ability to speak without restrictions. We're not stopping people from speaking about how they're feeling or what they think about things, but classified information is different than just speaking about opinions and what you think about something. Classified information is like, taking a first grader and trying to teach that first grader calculus. It's going to end up having negative effects, right? Because the first grader doesn't have the foundation before learning calculus, the addition, the subtraction, to learn these things so that they can excel in calculus. It's the same thing by feeding citizens this classified information that they don't really have the background information to, or how this came about, or why this is. It's just going to have negative effects, and it's going to lead us to paranoia, just like anthrax and those frenzies. It's going to have negative effects, and eventually nothing good is going to come from it. Just like the swine and anthrax, it didn't end up becoming the pandemic that we thought it would be. So it was this huge frenzy and paranoia for no reason. So what we say is that we need to be able to have some type of trust in our government to handle these things properly. And not only that, we have plenty of knowledge. We know about drone strikes. We know about Guantanamo Bay. We know about these things, and we have enough knowledge to be able to combat those things without having leaks of classified information, like more leaks. Like, we have enough information to be able to make change as citizens, and classified information is just going to have a negative effect on us.
I'm going to take a little bit of time. All right, so the negative position came up and told you that we elected these people, therefore we need to trust them. This is a problem because they're not taking into consideration the corporate influence in elections. Also, they're not taking into consideration the fact that they might get corrupted, these people, while they're in office. So they're not taking in, we all know some people get corrupted when they're offered power. Power is has a corrupting influence on people. So we need to take that into consideration. They said that people cannot translate this information. It's like giving a first grader calculus information. They're comparing U.S. citizens to first graders. They're comparing people that have their full senses that they cannot understand what it is that torture does to people, what it is that drone strikes do to people. They are comparing people to first graders, and that is not right. Our right as citizens is to know what's going on in the country because we own this country. People own the government of the United States. They also said this leads to government shutdown and less openness. That is the whole point of the affirmative, to reduce criminal liability for people to do this. Even if they cramp down, which is right against the affirmative, it won't be possible because they have reduced the liability, the criminal liability of these acts. They also, they haven't answered the checks and balances on the government. They have gone through this debate without talking about the checks and balance on the government of the United States. We know because of the leaks that had happened that United States is doing things that it's not supposed to do. They're doing things that are unconstitutional. They're doing things that infringe on the privacy of people and infringe sometimes on human rights. So they're saying they're not answering this question that how we can get these checks and balances. They, in their speech, once they say that we can trust government, they say they can't trust the government. And we don't know where they stand. They need to be able to answer that. And they say we know about these drone strikes and these wiretapping and all that stuff. The reason we know this is because of the leaks that has happened. And we need to have these leaks because we need to know about more of the instances that these things are happening. That's an important part of a debate that they're dismissing. They're not talking about it. At the end of the day, they need to realize these information is owned by the government, but the government is owned by the people. And they need to be accountable to the people of the United States. And these leaks allow the people to learn about what their government is doing in their name.
We'll take Brett. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I'm ready. So, we are not trying to compare the American people to first graders. What my partner, Miss Nadia Lewis, was trying to articulate was that when we don't understand and necessarily know something, you have a novice understanding of it. I might be a graduate student within the communications department, but I'm just like a first grader when you take me to quantum physics. I don't know. I just don't know it. So there's always a novice level. So what Nadia was trying to articulate is the general American public do not actually know the intricacies and the nuanced nature of the inner ins and outs of the politics. And that's the reason that we elect officials to carry on that duty. If this was a true democracy, then we wouldn't just have these like elected officials. We'd all be able to have a vote within that thing. But we designated it out, our forefathers designated this idea out for we the people to be able to elect people that can convey our constituency groups. Now, the problem is with this is when we start to leak this classified information of our officials that we have once trusted. Now Tom says that, you know, what about the government corruption? It becomes a non-unique argument in the face that the officials, if they're corrupted on our side, they're also corrupted on your side as well, and you're still trusting them to do your reforms. But even if we do start to leak this classified information, the fact that we weren't there, it becomes a game of like telephone. Do you all know the game of telephone where one person starts with something and by the end of it, it's something completely different? It's the same way with this classified information. We might think that it happened something, but by the time it gets to the American public, we have no idea. Now, the instances of swine flu and anthrax is we wanted the American public to know, but we let them know too soon. And that classified information got leaked out, and it had a paranoia and a frenzy of something that was minute and never even became that big of a deal. So many people were buying so much stuff and having the gas mask around that I know I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. We had gas masks on, and I can promise you there was no anthrax in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, what I'm trying to say is that right here and there is this transparency, even though if the government curtails criminal liability on this idea of leaking classified information, what they're mishandling is that it's going to become less transparent. The government might not pursue criminal charges, but they're going to lock it down so hard that you're never going to ever know anything. We're going to know even less now than what they already have. We just have to kind of take what we have now, where we can get a little bit of information, and go with that. Because if we don't, they're going to lock it down, kind of almost like the iPhone 5, where you can do your face recognition, your fingerprint, and everything else. This is how the classified information is going to be. Well, we will never know any classified information from here on out. No, so therefore, if we can have the checks and balances, and what I mean is we can have checks and balances on our government, and we can make demands on the state, but the only way to have a true check and balance, in my eyes, is in the world that we have a democracy like we do in the status quo, even if we release this stuff, is true anarchy. And if the question is, do you want that?
Thank you very much.
I am going to introduce our fabulous moderator, and then he in turn is going to introduce his panel and lead us on an adventure this afternoon. Our moderator is Michael Lukens, who I have had the opportunity to get to know over the last year or so, and I'm a huge fan. He has 26 years of experience in government communications at the local, state, and federal level. He currently is press secretary for our fabulous mayor, Ashley Swearingen, and for the city of Fresno. He previously served as communications director for Congressman George Radonovich and has served as deputy press secretary for four Pennsylvania governors. He also has experience in communication offices in a number of Pennsylvania state agencies. Additionally, he is a lecturer on this campus in at Fresno State's Department of Political Science, and he is the creator and the editor of the Maddie Daily, a daily newsletter focused on policy and political issues in the San Joaquin Valley and in California. And a little plug for that particular publication: if you go to the MaddieInstitute.org, you can sign up for the Maddie Daily, and it is seriously the only source of information that most folks need. It is so thorough and fabulous, so kudos on that. A little commercial. Okay. A former reporter, Lukens received his bachelor's degree in public policy from Penn State and a master's of public administration from this very place, Fresno State. And now, Michael and your panel, have a good time.
Great. Thanks, Betsy. I appreciate it. That's some build-up. Big fan of yours as well. Thanks for all your work in putting it together. I'm also a big fan of the people we have on the panel list. We're very fortunate to have some really smart people who have spent a lot of time around government and politics in the San Joaquin Valley over the past few decades. To my immediate left is John Ellis. He's the political reporter for the Fresno Bee. If you're a mover and shaker in government or politics in the San Joaquin Valley, John has you in his contact list on his cell phone. Crosshairs, he says, yes. To his left, Paul Hurley, more than 30 years as a newspaper man, including the last 3 with the Visalia Times Delta, where he was the community conversation editor. Paul has a ton of experience and has really figured out a way to engage the community and expand the traditional role of an opinion page editor while he was in Visalia. And at the far left is representing politics and government would be a familiar face to the Valley, Juan Arambula. You know Juan from the school board. He was a county supervisor and also an assembly member where he was an endangered species. He was a moderate legislator who actually tried to read every bill that came before him when he was a member. Not sure how long that lasted, Juan.
Couple of years,
okay. And we want to talk today about the media and politicians / government officials and talk about that relationship. And on its best day, there's inherent tension in that relationship. That the term that I've heard used is frenemies. That they're not really friends, not really enemies. They fall somewhere in that spectrum. That they may be closer to friends one day and closer to enemies the next, but they're never really either one of them. And as I said, on the best day, there's inherent tension, but this isn't really the best day for that relationship. I think folks up here can agree with that I think there's an increased amount of tension, that I think you'll generally find politicians having a certain amount of distrust for the media. The media has a certain amount of distrust for politicians or government officials. And complicating matters beyond that is that the public doesn't really trust either one. So with that cheery assessment of the situation, I want to start just by talking to each of them, trying to get a sense of where they see the current state of this relationship, where it is now, how it's developed over the years, and how it's changed, because each person has been in the field they're in for a long time, and I know things have changed significantly. So I'll start with John and just ask John, how do you see that relationship? Where does it stand right now? And how much has the relationship changed between the media, you, and the folks you cover in government over the time you've been a reporter?
I guess I suppose I think it's based on the individual. Some are very comfortable dealing with the media. I think Juan is an example of somebody who usually takes my phone calls and is not afraid to answer the questions that I put to him. Others are at various points on the spectrum. Some fear me, and I'm really not a scary person. Usually, I always figure that if you're comfortable in your skin, you're going to be comfortable asking whatever questions I'm going to ask you. If you haven't done anything wrong, then you should have no problem answering the questions. Now, that's the individual. I think the apparatus, the bureaucracy that is built up over the years has made it much harder to do my job. I think of, like, on a big level, there's the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court that makes it a lot harder for us in the media, and you know what, everybody else too, just your average person, to be able to find out where money is coming from to fund candidacies, candidates. Just in the last few years, just covering an election is much different than it was even 6 years ago, and that's because of all these independent expenditure groups, these independent organizations that are essentially running these shadow campaigns. I mean, they're doing almost everything that the politician himself, his campaign used to do not that many years ago, and that's, they'll do polling and they'll run commercials and they'll do mailers into your mailbox, and all of these are not coming from the candidate. They're coming from a group that is supposedly not supposed to be having any coordination with the candidate, whoever that candidate may be for whatever office, and it makes it really hard to figure out who's funding these campaigns. So because you want to know who's behind this person. What are these person's stances? Okay, well, they favor this, they're against this. Okay, so you can kind of get a general idea where the money might be coming from, but you don't really know. And so I think that makes it harder. And just on a general basis, just like I said, some of these people that are afraid to talk to me, they, I think, surround themselves with more and more layers of spokesmen like Mike himself. But as the layers of government get higher, it's harder to reach. And this could be a congressman. I've over the years found some of them to be very easy. Devin Nunes, for instance, always takes my calls. I have his cell phone. I call him. I ask him a question. I don't think he's ever hardly said to me, I'm not going to answer that. There's some people that are on the other side who just want to put up every roadblock they can to answering my questions, and they have a little phalanx of press people or people that deal with the media, and maybe they have front groups too that hasn't been known. Somehow you get routed off to some organization that is speaking on their behalf. Maybe it's one of these independent groups that doesn't go away. They seem to be around pushing for a cause or an agenda. So I think those are just some basic lines of how I find it to be much harder and different. You got to be, we're all adjusting, I think, on the run to try to cover this.
Yeah, I think we're going to get back to the transparency issue in a little bit, but And spokespeople are really good people. Don't let John mislead you.
And I think that's part of their job is to be good people. They're not there to be, they certainly aren't there to be your enemies. They're there to be your friends. These frenemies thing,
Yeah. Okay, Paul, I know we talked a little bit about this yesterday. What's your take on it?
I'm looking forward to talking about that layers of concealment that John brought up. First, it was kind of funny to listen to Ken Paulson and his First Amendment quiz earlier when he made the point that the press, the media's role has always been to antagonize public officials and office holders. There should be a relationship somewhat of antagonism there. And I believe that and agree with it because they have two different missions. The press and the media has a different mission than the people who are elected to serve us, but they also have to work together. It's a little bit like the roles between the public and the police, for instance. The police are your friend when you need help, but when they pull you over for speeding, they're enemies, right? So there's times when the mission converges and times when they are very much antagonistic. I would definitely say that the relationship between public officials and the people who cover them in the media has deteriorated over the years, during my career and even before that. Back in the day, you can go to the early 60s and 50s, for instance, journalists and public officials were friends. They'd go out to dinner together. They would share experiences. They would go on vacation. They would consult with each other all the time. One of John Kennedy's best friends was Ben Bradley of the Washington Post. He would go over to dinner to his house. That would never take place today. That would never take place today. And there are a number of reasons why that has happened. The layers, the onion of concealment, of withdrawal that the public sector has set up is one of them. But one of the main ones is also the mechanics of the way the media now communicates with the public. Back when journalists and public officials were friends or had closer relationships, there was only newspapers and maybe the start of television, 3 channels, and everybody knew who they were. Now you've got not only television, radio, and electronic journalism, you've got Twitter, you've got Facebook. Public officials and those in office have so many other ways to communicate with their constituents, with the public now, and they can bypass the media altogether. They don't need a filter. They can go directly to the public, and most public officials are using Facebook and Twitter. Look how our current president has used them to his great advantage. Barack Obama, himself and his people are masters of communication through the electronic media. So that's created a distance, and it's also in the minds of many office holders created a sense that, well, I don't really need to talk to John Ellis. I'm going to just tweet what my reaction is to, the death of Nelson Mandela, for instance. And I'm sure that happened today. And there are a lot of other examples, but I will turn it over to Juan Arambula and see if he agrees with John and I.
Okay, Juan, you come from a slightly different place on this, but tell us where you are on where you see the state of the relationship and how you felt it changed over the years as you were a public official.
Well, one comment is that recently in Sacramento there was a political corruption case involving Senator Ron Calderon, and for the life of me, I don't know where our media was at, or at least local and state and national. Al Jazeera broke the story. This was not something that happened overnight. It was happening for many months and years, and it makes me think that the watchdog capacity of the media has deteriorated. Maybe it's because of all of the changes going on, and certainly in print journalism, we've seen some major changes, downsizing. We've seen the loss of a lot of experienced investigative reporters. Things are shaking out a little bit, and I don't know where they will end, but In the meantime, it seems to me that elected officials, politicians, are getting away with a lot of things that the public should know about, and unfortunately, we don't know. Now as a private citizen, I am interested in finding out some of the inner workings, but it requires a great deal of persistence over a period of time, and a good deal of expertise, a lot of life experience under the belt of the reporters to ferret out the truth, to ferret out what's actually going on. Issues like water or the state budget are incredibly complex. And what I've seen all too often is our new reporters coming on the scene, not really knowing where to go. And the easiest thing is to ask somebody what they think, ask somebody else, the opposing, from the opposing view, what they think. So you have a he said, she said situation without going further and trying to dig into the story to find out what's really going on. So I value the watchdog role of media. I think it has been incredibly helpful in making sure that our institutions and elected officials are held accountable. But I am concerned about the long-term viability of that investigative capacity. And if that should continue to deteriorate, my fear is that the elected officials will see that as an opportunity to do things that they shouldn't be doing.
All right, thanks, Juan. I'm good. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to note, I totally agree with what Juan was saying. The Fresno Bee no longer has a reporter in Sacramento, and we are part of the McClatchy newspaper chain, so there is the Sacramento Bee, which has a whole group of reporters up there, but for whatever reason, they don't really care about what goes on down here in Fresno. They're covering it from a Sacramento point of view or from a statewide point of view. So if we have, for instance, something that is Fresno specific, unless it rises to a level that is very, very high, it's probably going to go under the radar screen just because nobody's even there to watch for it, let alone, and Juan's also right. And I noticed some of the people, nothing against the Sacramento Bee, some of their new hires, but they're kids. I mean, they're like in their early 20s, just out of J school, and you wonder if they're really ready to step into such big responsibility and get to like true stories that are, the stories below the stories that, and what's really going on. So I just was going to bring that up as a note.
I would agree with that, and I think, in fact, besides the Bee, I think the Los Angeles Times is the only other newspaper in the state that's got a full-time reporter in Sacramento. And every newspaper in the state or chain, I used to work for Gannett, they would have a reporter in Sacramento covering the doings every day, and that just doesn't take place anymore. The other thing is economic. It takes money and time and a lot of work to do an expose, for instance, like what the LA Times pulled off with the corruption in Bell, California. That series took months of reporting and digging before it broke. And newspapers and media outlets don't have that kind of time or money or staff anymore. And everything has gotten compressed. The public's attention span has gotten so shortened thanks to things like Twitter and Facebook and the 24-hour news cycle.
All right, I was going to chime in to say that for better or worse, and say what you want about Governor Schwarzenegger, he made covering state government cool.
He did. I mean, a bunch of everybody beefed up the bureaus.
Yeah, everybody.
But then when he left town, so did everybody.
Yeah, there was a mad rush to get reporters to Sacramento to cover state government. Now, how they covered state government may not have been what you thought it could have been, but once he left, covering state government was no longer cool again for some reason. That the Bee doesn't have a bureau up there, and as John says, that if there's a Fresno legislator up doing something in Sacramento, they have an open field to run on.
Unless somebody calls us from up there, or unless the Sacramento Bureau, what they'll usually do is they'll tip us. But then we're down here, and then once again, it's very hard to cover stuff up there when you're down here. And as Paul was saying, and our newsroom's been hollowed out, and we have to put out a paper every day. So if you want to do something long term, you got to squeeze it into cracks when you're not getting stories done to keep a paper going 7 days a week.
And what's an assignment editor going to say? The reporter goes to say, well, I can give you a front page story on a quick topic for tomorrow, or I can spend 3 weeks on the road digging into this story that might give you a story next month. which is the sign they're going to pick when if they have the choice to do so.
Right. I want to get touch on the resource issue from this angle for a little bit. That whether you're in the newspaper or the media business or you're in government, you're in the relationship business. That it's really about building relationships. And with younger reporters, Paul, if you could start, what are the challenges with that? That I know back in the day when I was a reporter and folks in business now, you need time to develop sources, you need time to develop trust, and you need time to really get up on what you're doing and do your job well. And the resource issue probably presents a particular challenge right now.
Yeah, it does, because there's a lot of turnover. And as John points out, there's a lot of younger reporters coming into the business, and you could pay them less money so that the news organization can save money by employing younger people, and that's also an economic issue. Michael's very right. I also teach journalism at the College of Sequoias. One of the things I tell reporters is that the news business is a relationship business. Your job really is to develop relationships with sources. If you're a beat reporter, you need to know those people. You need to know what makes them tick, what makes them think, what they're passionate about, where they're going to be, and basically what you can expect on how they're going to perform in public office. That takes time, as any of you know. Relationships take time to build. You don't build them overnight over one simple exchange. And these days, you've got a public official is confronted by a whole bunch of reporters whom he doesn't know. And some of them are going to be shoving an iPhone in their face and saying, "I'm here from breakingnews.com." Well, who's that? It might be the last time that you see that person. And it is the first time you see them. And public officials are going to be a little bit reticent, a little bit distrustful, very shy about sharing things with someone they don't know real well. What are they going to do with this information? When you develop a good relationship with a source, it's much easier to cover that. They are going to share with you more, they're going to trust you more, and they're going to give you inside information that you're not going to get if you don't know them real well. And I'm sure that Juan could confirm that with his relationships with media over the years.
Yeah, I was going to ask Juan. Juan, you had a reputation as somebody who was accessible, somebody who the media could turn to, and you'd be candid with them. What was your philosophy about dealing with the media, and what sorts of things did you look for when you dealt with a reporter to see whether you thought you would get a fair shake or not at the end of the day?
It's sort of trial by fire. If there was a new reporter, you would obviously watch for the story to come out and see if it was pretty balanced overall. And overall, in the many years I was in elective office, I think I had very good relationships with almost every reporter or journalist that I had experience with a few exceptions. But my main concern was not with an angry or surly or somebody that I distrusted. It was more that the reporter was green and didn't know what to ask me. I had several reporters from TV stations that would say to me, my editor or my assignment editor just told me to come out here and cover your press conference. What should I ask you? And that's the opposite of getting tough questions, and I think it's just as dangerous in a way, because you could say a lot of things without any checks and balances, and I think that's the role, that's the relationship. You mentioned frenemy. I think to me it's more like checks and balances. Right. If you allow elected officials to do what they want, then we run the risk of having this look like a third world country where folks can do whatever they want with impunity without having to worry about the consequences. And so my fear, politicians will be politicians, and then there's good ones and bad ones, and the bad ones deserve scrutiny. But if we can't scrutinize them, my fear is that over time we'll gradually get more and more bad ones.
Now, we're all from the generation where tweeting is something that may not come instinctively to us, except for John. John tweets all the time. Juan, if you were an elected official today, how would you use social media? What role do you think that would play in your overall communication strategy?
I honestly don't know. I think that's something for newer elected officials, newer politicians to respond to. I never really got a handle on the social media. I use the traditional media, and as I was leaving office was when this newer form of communication was really kicking up. So I'm not sure what I would do, except count my lucky stars that I'm not, that I don't have to deal with that situation.
Okay, Paul and John, I want you both to address that we touched a little bit on this earlier, that elected officials can either talk to the media directly or past the media through social media, through Twitter, Facebook, whatever they do. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on social media and the challenges and how it impacts?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, media is a conduit. When a public official is communicating with the media, they really are communicating with the public, or they should be. The media should only be the conduit, the wire that gets that message from the public official to the public they're trying to communicate with. It shouldn't just be talking to the media. These days, the public officials don't need the filter. They don't need that conduit. They don't have to go through the media. They can go directly to the public through a number of different ways. One of them is Twitter. Others are Facebook, Pinterest. What's the Snap.com. Some of you probably tell me some of the other things where people. Instagram. That's what I was searching for. And they can go directly to the public. Now, I suspect that when they do that, they are communicating with their choir. They are sending out the message to their supporters that are going to reinforce that support or the good feelings that public has, that segment of the public has for the public official. So I kind of worry about that, the use of these social media, especially if it's done exclusively, and some office holders do use that exclusively, is only going to reinforce partisanship, that you're only going to have people who think the same way receiving those messages and talking to each other about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I just recently did an obituary on George Zinovich, who had served in the Assembly and the State Senate from Fresno, and just in talking to people, of this bygone era of California politics in which, these guys fought like heck when they were in the chamber, but then they would go to Frank Fat's and, have cocktails, and the guys were friends, the Ken Maddie and George Zinovich and a lot of those guys from that era. I mean, they were friends, and I think you saw some of that even in Congress, where I think the one that probably made the most news was that Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch were very close, and those guys, it seemed like they hated each other when you watched them go at each other on the floor. But once they got out of there, they were friends, and I think that is completely disappearing. And I think, as Paul's right, social media is helping widen that gulf, because you're speaking to the choir. Nobody who hates you is going to go to your website and read your news, or they're not going to follow. They might follow you on Twitter, but only so they can get pissed off at you. And follow you on Facebook if you accept them, only so they can just see what they want to be mad about. So there was very little of this common ground that I think we saw.
And the public official doesn't have to make an argument. They don't have to sell anything.
Yeah.
Because they already know that they've got you in their corner. So there's less dialogue, there's less debate.
And I think they're trying to ignore us under the pretense that newspaper readership is down. And it is of the traditional paper that you hold in your hand in the morning, it is. But I think and I'm sure the Times Delta, it's the same deal. For the Bee, the people who are actually reading our website is bigger than ever. But the thing about the internet is everybody can have a website. So, we have our website. Devin Nunes has his website. He puts out his own little newsletter that views the news through his lens. And my personal belief is that you're not ever going to get a true picture other than the Devin Nunes view of the world if you read his newsletter. I still believe that we, despite the talk out there that we're the liberal media, we're the left, we're the leftists or whatever the heck we are. And just the other day I got attacked for being a diehard conservative. So you know what, I figure if I'm getting attacked from both sides, I must be doing something right, which is to give you as the fullest story to the best of my ability as to what is going on. And I mean the real story, not the he said, she said type of thing that we have been discussing here.
I don't know if this happened to you, John, but somewhere more than 10 years ago was the first time that I called somebody for a comment or some statement about a point of public policy, and I was shocked to get the answer to them. Oh, well, that's on my website. Go look at my website and you get the answer there. Politicians are actually just referring journalists to their website where they've already gotten this prepackaged message that they want them to then transfer as news. And when that happened for the first time, I realized, uh-oh, things have changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I almost think that if I was an editor, I would be assigning my reporter to just say they declined to comment, other than, you know, because I just think if we let them get away with it, I think there's a mini controversy. The Pentagon has made it, I think, a point of policy to refer almost all reporters to their website for answers to questions they may have.
Oh, you read a story about the armed forces today, and that's the main source. What is it, Pentagon.gov or something like that? USA.gov. Yeah, that's now the Pentagon's main source.
Yeah.
So what can you do about that?
Well, I think we need to return to developing relationships, but like I said, that takes time, and it takes some expertise in developing relationships and knowing people and getting to know them. Whenever I would either get a new assignment, a new beat, or have to cover a new person, I would try to find some time before that to get to know them and to sit down and talk informally, just to find out who they were and a little bit about them, so that I'd have a little better idea of how to approach them, what kind of questions they are apt to answer, what kind of questions they're apt to want to stonewall, because there's kind of an art to conducting an interview. You don't go in and sort of give them the expose question number one. You got to kind of work your way up to that. And to do that, you've got to develop relationships with people, so you need to take that time. So if we can get back to doing that, maybe we can return to actually covering the news instead of having it being broadcast or pasted on a website, and then us just having to retrieve it and copy it.
Juan, how frustrated, if they are at all, how frustrated are the elected officials in Sacramento about this lack of investigative reporting that you spoke about earlier? I can't imagine that people are sitting there fretting that they're not being covered as in-depth as they would like to be.
Do you remember that phrase, I'm okay, you're okay, we're all okay? I think that's a prevailing sentiment. Anybody who questions that is kind of the skunk at the picnic. But we need more skunks. We need more people to unearth this kind of information. I'm just really amazed that established news organizations that have been around for years didn't know that the FBI was investigating a major corruption case yet again in Sacramento. I think the same may well be happening at the regional or local level, but we don't know until something, an official FBI investigation or criminal prosecution comes out. I do think that the media needs to be applauded for when they do good work, and they need to be encouraged to go even further when they're not. But politicians, I think, sometimes have a negative view of journalists and the press because they oftentimes don't understand what the limitations are of a reporter. You know, when somebody calls at 4:30 p.m. and says, I need to know by 5, I need to know your response by 5, if somebody doesn't know what the deadline, pressures are or what the work environment is of the reporter, they might just shine it on and say, well, I'm not going to respond because they want to jam me on that. So I think elected officials need to have a better understanding of what the working conditions are, the environment, the pressures of journalists, and vice versa. So maybe there is room, Paul, to encourage more civil discussions or interactions so that we can see each other as people and not as the enemy.
I'd extend that to say the public really doesn't know what the media does or how they work either. A lot of times in my career, I was confronted by people who would tell me, don't you know that this is happening? And they would expect that somehow I am omniscient and that I know everything because I work for a newspaper. And it said, no, I didn't know that. Where can I get more information about that? Well, everybody knows that. The fact is that any reporter, whether it's Paul Hurley or John Ellis, will not be able to get information unless somebody tells them. We can't make stuff up. We can't just pluck facts out of
Contrary
air.
to popular opinion.
Yeah, you need to have sources. You need to have ways of retrieving information. And it's being made a lot more difficult to do that. John touched on it earlier about some of the layers of concealment that campaigns, for instance, are using to hide where their money's coming from and how they're spending it in the campaign. Well, that's happening in government too. I think I shared with Michael yesterday that I feel the First Amendment has never been more threatened, and I think it's because especially our public officials, maybe not as individuals, but as an institution, continues to work hard to try to conceal what is going on in their government. No less than Governor Jerry Brown this year proposed a couple of measures that would have undermined our ability to retrieve information from their government. Jerry Brown.
Juan, sorry, John.
That's okay.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up first with Juan on that. I know you wouldn't support those kinds of limitations on the public's right to know, but how does that happen? What's the environment in Sacramento that allows something like that to not just get a little bit of traction, but really make it pretty far down the road before there's a huge public outcry about it?
I was referring to Brown's measure to suspend parts of the Brown Act because they wanted local governments to fund it, and basically said, well, if you can't, you don't have to follow the Brown Act. That was just one of the things.
Under the guise of saving money, of course.
Under the guise of saving money.
It always makes me wonder, is it really saving money? Is some brain trust really think, oh, this is a good way to save money, or is there an ulterior motive? I would always wonder.
I don't know. I like Jerry Brown. I think he's a reasonable person in the room, and it's good to have somebody with some experience and stature in Sacramento as the governor. I do think that funding for the Brown Act or for enforcement for the Brown Act can be discussed and debated. I don't think it was his intent to curtail the ability of the media to do its job. He was raising a budget issue. I believe it was just a budget issue, but it did have other overtones to it. I certainly would not encourage or support something that clipped the wings of the media because I think they need to go even further than they have been able to. I guess where would I draw the line? Maybe like in a situation in a World War II where there was information about troop transports or things that could have immediate harmful effects on our ability to prosecute the war. But it would have to be something truly exceptional, and even then I'd be wary of drawing that line because oftentimes elected officials at the national, state, or local level use these kinds of pretexts as a reason not to want the media to inquire much further. And for me, usually where there's smoke, there's fire. And if the more they say no, the more I would want the media to be able to go in there and unearth whatever they can.
Would you say it's a matter of unintended consequences of government officials enacting these things, or is it a deliberate attempt to try to, I'm at work here. I really don't want to have somebody looking over my shoulder, and that would be a natural thing to understand because nobody does like to have people looking over their shoulder while they're working. But which is it deliberate or is it kind of unintentional?
Explain what is deliberate or
any attempt to deny the public full knowledge of the processes of their government.
I think in most cases it's an attempt to make sure nobody is looking over their shoulder or second guessing their decisions.
Well, I was thinking something, Juan. You were talking about troop transports, or maybe that we had we had broken the Japanese code,
Right.
and I think that those are probably things that you would prefer, and even the media should probably agree that should not be out there. But then in Vietnam, then you had, the My Lai massacre and things like that, and, I'm sure that, for the good of the war, that they probably would have preferred that those not get out too. But I think, that's where the relationship started changing. I think from the Kennedy days of the, we go out to dinner together to, I think some of the reporting changed. And I think the Vietnam War drove a lot of that, and exposing that thing, having the caskets being filmed when they were coming back home, whereas Bush 41 did not allow that from the Gulf War one because of the negative connotations that and I think there was a fight there as the what's the for the what's the for the good of the public versus I guess what's for the good of the the war effort or whatever you want to say. But I think you push up to that fine line. I think some are obvious, like the troop transports, but I think when your government goes off the rails, that's what we're supposed to do. We have to be. I'm a natural skeptic, and it's just part of my job. And I think if you're not a natural skeptic, you should go to PR. If you're a journalism major, immediately head over to the PR department.
Yeah, exactly.
Get that job because that's perfect for you. But if you're a skeptic, and if you question things, and sometimes it's nothing, or sometimes the person who's doing something's really doing something good, or they're trying to do something good, fine, good for them. Sometimes they're not. And I have no problem saying, hey, good job. The story, sometimes you get teased, oh, well, how much money did they pay you? Or what's, somebody teases you in the newsroom because, you've actually written a good positive story about it. Well, that's the way it turned out. But if it turns out the other way, and the politician better understand it, that I'm going to report that too.
Okay.
Skepticism, curiosity is one of the first things I always tell young journalists that they need to have that quality. If they don't have that, don't even bother. Skepticism definitely is right up there, maybe equal. What's happened in newsrooms, though? You have a lot of skeptical people about any sort of action that government takes, and they will question everything. Even if it looks innocent, all of a sudden it becomes, they're trying to pull something here. They're trying to conceal something. Sometimes they are, but you probably always have to have that sort of attitude about it.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the things that's driving a bit of a wedge between media and public officials, too.
And I think that skepticism is well-founded, too, because a lot of elected officials would wrap themselves up in a flag as an excuse not to allow people to ask questions.
And how much fun is it to have George Hofstadter deal with you?
Well, George
our City Hall reporter.
I just wanted to clarify something you said earlier, that you didn't say that if you lack intellectual curiosity, you become a spokesman. Yeah. That isn't what I heard.
I said to go to PR.
Okay, go to PR. Okay.
Definite difference there, Mike.
Okay, I do. I want to read something that was said in this very room today, and I want particularly to get John's reaction to it. And I'll tell you why, but I'd like everyone to check in on it because it's right along with what we're talking about. The speaker said, our freedoms are under fire from government officials who snoop on us and are committed to limiting access to our government. And before you answer, John, I'll tell you that these words were said by your boss, Jim Boren. So disagree at your own peril. But, just a general reaction to that.
I don't think he can just fire me out of hand. Well, I partially, somewhat I agree. If we're talking like as a human, as just a normal guy that, lives in Clovis and has kids in school, my personal feeling is the government has no business in my personal life. I haven't done anything wrong. If that's what he's talking about, the NSA email spying, bad pun, bugs me. I don't like it. Stay out of my life. And if you can go out and do what I'm supposed to do, which I'm supposed to go, I can't just cast this. It'd be like us reporting, I guess, something. Just this wide net casting. They should do what we have to do, which is go out and prove something. Then you go to the FISA, the secret court, or whatever hurdles you have to jump through, or through the local. Through a local judge, and they approve a search warrant, or they approve a wiretap. It's not right. It is whatever our country is founded on, which is a free press, and also a free people to be free of government intervention in our lives. And I would add to that because the lines are getting blurred more. Corporate America, all this specialized advertising, and you're bombarded, and you're being tracked, your spending's being tracked. I hate loyalty cards. It's just personal. It's just a personal feeling. I don't want to register just so I can get a disc. I'd rather pay more money, at Home Depot than to sign up for something so they can track all my spending, because it just bothers me. So to me, it's all hand in hand, and it's government, it's corporations, it's the good and the bad. We have this tremendous thing. The internet's tremendous, and some of this, everything being, this news and being able to talk to my friends in Europe on Facebook, and it's all of it has a good side, all of it has a bad side, and and I think there's that once again where it's the same principles, that we had 100 years ago with the media and government, and now it's that same tug of war is we've got to keep the principles of our nation intact, if that's what we want, So yeah, I mean, some of what Jim says is I agree with, are we in peril? Possibly.
Paul? I think I'd agree with more than 100%, maybe 110%.
I was going to say, yeah.
I only work for him occasionally.
I thought Jim might have been a little weak with his comments.
No, I definitely the thing about the government snooping on private individuals and others. We've got evidence of that. That's happening. And there are more and more ways to do that now, thanks to technology. So that is very scary, and certainly the government is not going to be the ones to initiate controls, to put controls on that. They're going to try to expand it as much as they can. It's kind of funny that John brought up the way war has been covered in our country historically. In World War II, the war correspondents went out with the troops right to the front line. Many of them lost their lives. Some of the most famous correspondents and journalists in this country were killed in World War II because they were right up there on the front at places like Iwo Jima and Anzio and Normandy. When you got to Vietnam, the journalists went out on their own. Guys like David Halberstam went out and covered the war independently. By the time you get to Iraq and Afghanistan, the media is being controlled by the military. They can only go where the military tells them. They have to go in certain kinds of units back from the lines, and it's under the guise of protecting those people. But it's not. The motivation is to control the information. Don't ever think that it isn't. And that is just the trend of our government.
Juan, any thoughts?
No, I'll pass on that one.
Okay, you're going to pass on that one. Okay.
Enough said.
Good. I did want to open it up to anyone. If there are any questions out there for anybody that you've spent your life wishing you had an opportunity to ask John Ellis a question. I will go to the back and then to this beautiful young woman here. Go ahead in the back.
They tell a certain story from a certain point of view. I think it's very limited, pretty much limited to what the military wants you to. Because I mean, it was my understanding that the way it looked to me from my point of view is that these guys were brought into these units and they were almost became part of these units, and they, and I, I'm sure it was, I believe it was probably concerted effort that to make these guys feel like they were part of the unit. They were buddies, and they became friends, or whatever you want to say, with these, with these guys in the unit. And I think that makes it very hard, when you cross that line and you get to be too close to these people, it makes it very hard to do an objective reporting on what they're doing. So, I personally, whatever, it is what it is. Is there a place for it? Fine, yeah, fine. But I also think that, that the guys should, that there's way too much control, because that's the only reporting they allowed. When that, if that's just one angle, that's fine. These guys should be able to go out and do whatever. I think do the thing. If they're going to risk their lives and they want to, cross the lines, whatever. In Vietnam there was very blurry as to what was a front line. and what wasn't, because of the Viet Cong and the guerrilla warfare that was going on in the South. If you're going to risk your life, for the story, then I think our government should not get in the way. Once again, war's ugly. I think we all know that. Terrible things happen. Terrible things happened in World War II. But if the public wants to know, and I think the public has a right to know, as long as it's not, as Juan I think was saying earlier, as long as it's not a deeply held military secret, like there's going to be a bombing run tomorrow on a certain city, or we're planning this attack, or we've cracked their code. We probably, those things, I think there is a line I think that reasonable people can agree upon. Even a journalist, even a skeptical journalist can agree upon shouldn't probably be out in the public. So Paul wants to add to that.
I'm no expert in warfare journalism.
Yeah, neither am I, by the way. Unless you count the Fresno County Supervisor.
Yeah, our county has some battles down there too. But the way the government approaches journalism, it's a good analogy to other kinds of coverage of government. Is it more efficient to do it that way? To actually control the reporting and have reporters embedded? Certainly. It's more efficient for everybody. And even the reporter, they don't have to chase around and find people. They're right there. Is it more complete? You can never claim that it would be. Is it less biased? Is it more unbiased and objective? There's no way it can be. There's no way it can be. Now, apply that to any other thing that you're covering about government, about a government function. Set aside war, for instance. Let's say you're covering the IRS. And the reporter that is covering the IRS and the IRS's predilection to spy on Americans, depending on what their political beliefs are, you're going to embed a reporter in the IRS to get the true story of what happened there? Would that happen? Anybody thinks that would happen, raise your hand. That's my point.
And I'm thinking too, just another thought. I completely lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, it was a very good question. Thank you.
Did we have one here?
It would make me nervous if I was told I could only talk to certain people or in certain areas. It'd be like here in Fresno, we have a gang problem, but you can only talk to certain folks. You can't go out and discover yourself. Or, what with the drug trade, limiting our sources, I think would really limit the role of the media in terms of its oversight function.
But I think this is a slippery slope. Because I think the military has been extraordinarily successful at this PR front that they have put forth in this whole thing of sanitizing war, and CNN just wants to get shots of like bombs blowing up because it makes for good TV. And so I think that it's likely to be replicated. Speaking of the, I don't know, embed them in the IRS or whatever, because if it works, then you probably want to keep doing it, because it is to the point now where if you criticize almost anything that the military does, well, you're criticizing the soldier. And that it's almost like it's a personal attack on the individual soldier. And I think that has been a concerted PR effort that came directly out of the Vietnam War, because almost every war that's been fought since then, you've just seen this, and they built this thing where like I said, if you're critical of a war effort, you're critical. The PR point is that you're critical of the actual soldiers themselves, and you're not supporting our soldiers.
Thanks, John. Any other questions?
Oh, good. Okay, next question. That's a tough one. I've talked about that with a couple of people today. I'm sorry I missed the debate. I'm sure it was very stimulating. I'm a guy that believes that all information ought to be open all the time, at any time. But I can understand the concerns of government in protecting our national security, especially in these days of such sophisticated electronic information services. So maybe on a case-by-case basis, but even that, who makes the decision that this information needs to be protected? I'm probably going to err on the side of put it out there and let the public decide.
Yeah, not my feeling about not WikiLeaks so much, but I'm thinking about Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
And I guess in I'd have to look at everything because I haven't seen the voluminous leaks that have been to come from him. But boy, he certainly, whatever you want to say about him, he shook things up. He did a journalist's job in a way, but just by throwing it all out there, not reporting it and trying to give context to it. But I think this whole NSA debate about spying on individual Americans who've done nothing wrong, nobody has known about it, and yet now we learn about it, and all of a sudden it's just talk about onions. It is deeper and deeper, and we find out that this monitoring is deep, it's widespread, and you know what I say? You know what? I'm glad that he exposed that because I'm glad I know that.
I would add this: I would prefer that whistleblowers come forward publicly and stand up for it rather than sequester themselves or go into other countries. Now, I can understand how the government can be pretty rough, but with the Pentagon Papers in the 1970s, Daniel Ellsberg took the hit and he went to prison. I think that's the kind of commitment to actually informing the public that people have to have.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Any other questions? No? We done?
No.
Yes?
As she's coming up, I remember what Henry Kissinger used to say to reporters: "Who has questions for the answers I've prepared?"
Yeah, that's right.
Well, first of all, thank you for a very interesting panel. I'm very curious your opinions regarding the First Amendment, particularly in the area where it appears that if something's a popular opinion, the First Amendment is completely protected. However, if it's not a popular opinion, it appears that it's hate speech or it somehow should be something that is not allowed to be spoken. So I'm curious your thoughts regarding the First Amendment and when it's protected and when it's not. Thank you.
Well, that's a tough question. Yeah. If you're a doctor who does abortions, should anti-abortion people have a right to set up shop in front of your house endlessly? Or I guess what's the Westboro Baptist Church? Mm-hmm. Can they go do their thing at the funerals of fallen soldiers? That is, because the First Amendment is more, than just, it's a lot of freedoms.
Yeah, it protects speech.
I would answer it by saying that the test of your commitment to the First Amendment is how tolerant of you are of speech that is totally antithetical to the way that you believe and live. So if you're a God-fearing Christian, will you accept the pronouncements of an atheist or someone who criticizes your religion? If you will, you're a supporter of the First Amendment. I like to think I am.
And I would point out that we have many rights under the Bill of Rights. None of them is totally absolute. They do have to be balanced with other rights, like the protection of an individual. But by and large, I would, wherever possible, err on the side of encouraging and allowing the free speech. I think it's been good for our country, and the more that we see that is impaired, I think that's when trouble can arise.
And I think a lot of it has to do, too, with common sense. There's a freedom of the press, but we cannot libel people. We can't just write anything we want about people. And if I go back to talking about the abortion doctor, I think if they want to put the aborted fetuses up in big giant signs right in front of his sidewalk of his neighborhood, for days on end or weeks or months, I think there's something where maybe you've crossed the line, maybe, and so just like we can't just print anything, we can't print anything we want, about people. When you're a public official, your protections are a lot less. We really, you go out to the public eye, whether you're an actor or you're a politician, you certainly give up some of those freedoms that average citizens have. But there is a line even for everybody. Everybody has a line, and we, I think we know we self-police ourselves in a way, or we can get sued too. We have to protect ourselves in court, but I think common sense, I've been doing this long enough, I know where that line is and what I can say, and I need to be able to prove it. And is it fair, is it germane to the person's position,
And if you don't know that, the Fresno Bee employs attorneys who will tell you. There is a large body of privacy and libel law that acts as a counterbalance to abuses of the First Amendment. So we as citizens should be grateful that that's there as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, great question. Any others? We have a couple more.
You guys mentioned earlier in the discussion where you guys said the public are skeptic of the media and politicians. Do you think that's justified? And do you think there's any way that the media or politicians can gain that trust back?
Yeah, certainly it's justified. The media screws up all the time. Politicians lie to us all the time. What's not to know that you definitely should have some skepticism of both institutions. And never trust anything at face value. Do you trust everything you see on either Fox News or MSNBC at face value? I hope not. And I hope you're also looking at other media outlets that will give you some balance and some alternatives to help you form your opinions.
Well, and I also think too, it speaks to me a larger distrust of public agencies and government and all the institutions that have served the country for 200 years are now, people are angry and they're nervous, and I don't know if that is having something to do with the fact that for, in my opinion, 30 years or more, things have been we kind of feel like we're treading water and maybe we're sinking a little, as a nation, and I think people are getting panicked. You have these shows on cable TV now about the doomsday preppers. I'm sure those guys have always been around, but nobody paid it, though they were wackos 30 years ago. Now they get their own TV shows, and I think they kind of feeds into this nervousness that I think we have as a society as to where we're going, and I think people are looking at us, and Paul's right, we do screw up all the time. I've had several corrections in my time at the Bee because I get somebody's name wrong, or kind of really embarrassing when I get facts wrong, and that sometimes happens in my rush to do something. But I think, politicians are the ratings for Congress are all-time low. Nobody's getting along. Everybody's nervous. Everybody's fighting. There's less and less cooperation. The gulf's getting wider. But I think, to me, it all feeds back to this 3-decade, 4-decade long, like I said, I think of a treading water. Maybe we're not sinking. Maybe we are. Maybe we're not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think government just has to be better too. That speaking as somebody who is in government right now, I know there are cases where if you call City Hall and you talk to 3 people, you could get 4 different answers. And government has to sharpen itself up a little bit. That doesn't create a lot of trust in the government institution itself when a member of the public deals with it. And I've worked in different places, but I've never seen a place like Fresno where people just go to the media with their issues. That, if they have a bad experience with government, they'll go to the media with it, and it's a fact of life. So, from my end, government just has to be sharper, has to be better at what it does, and it has to be more transparent in what it does. I hope this isn't old school, but I've always thought that the more information you get out, the better off you are. And some of the distrust is when an event happens and information just kind of drips out. It's like, the media thinks it's learned everything about it, and government's like, oh yes, we've told you everything.
Yeah, there's nothing like making a one-day story into a one-week story.
Yeah, a 5-6 day story, and you do that because, and I tell people all the time, the media, journalists are smart people, and they don't just talk to us. They're allowed to talk to different people and get more information, and as they get that information, then they can square it up with what they've been told by government. And if it doesn't square up, then you have a real issue with it.
Look on the bright side, though. Would you rather the country be run by the U.S. government or by J.P. Morgan Chase?
Okay, I saw another question somewhere. Sorry. That was a little loud.
Privacy has come up several times in your discussion. It actually came up briefly as one of the rights within the Constitution that we have as citizens. And an interesting question I have for you is whether you think this is a generational concern, because I brought this up talking about technology and things in class, and have a number of students say, well, everything's out there. I haven't done anything wrong. I put myself out all the time. I'm not worried about the government spying on me because I'm not doing anything wrong. if you have comments on, because there's appreciation I'm getting from you why this is something we want the media to look in to be concerned about, and a possible younger generation reaction. What's the big deal?
Yeah, this is the generation too that they take the risque pictures of themselves and send them around to you, right?
Or what was the new word in the dictionary where you take a picture of yourself?
Selfie. Yeah. Well, there's sexting as well. So.
There are some big changes going on in our society. They're not limited to just what's going on in the print press or in electronic media. There are lots of social changes going on. My view is that skepticism, going back to the earlier question, skepticism is healthy, but we need to have that check and balance system in place. But trust has eroded over time, and the only thing that will fix it is by having good, honest relationships over a long period of time. I think trust has to be earned to get back to where we were at one point. But these larger social changes, I don't know what to make of them. I suppose my father had the same concern when television was coming in, and I suppose his ancestors had similar concerns. Maybe it is a generational thing because young people seem to have a variety of different opinions, and as those of us in the older generation fall away, then the prevailing majority attitude seems to change, whether it's on gay rights or marijuana or other issues. I think these changes are generational, and maybe folks now have less concern because everything is out in the open. They're probably texting, pictures of themselves, and I don't really know. I mean, we're probably the wrong generation to ask that question. But I don't see that there's any way to reverse that. I think we will survive, and we will find a way to make the best out of it.
I guess I'm a little more skeptical than Juan is. Because I think it's a slippery slope, and so I understand when you say, "What's the big deal? I'm not doing anything wrong." And a guy I know in town, Mike Emanuel Jr., used to tease me under the Bush administration when I would criticize the Patriot Act because for these very issues, and then he would mock me by saying, "Oh, John Ellis on his way to Pizza Hut to get a pizza," and so his point was, what's the big deal? To me, the big deal is yeah, I agree, he's right, but what could this lead to? I mean, I think a lot of us here have probably read 1984, and then Orwell's point of this, taken to the so far down the road where where they actually have a two-way television and they're actually watching you to make sure you're exercising, And so, I think it's the whole, this is where something where almost a liberal and a conservative point of view can come around on the other side and come together, with the concerns over the whole the nanny state that the Republicans love to rail on, the nanny state. The government's, if you don't like the nanny state, then you probably shouldn't like the government, spying on your emails about going to Pizza Hut, even though you're just going to Pizza Hut. I'm not doing, so, that's the whole point of, being in a free society, is that they shouldn't just be able to spy on you. I've traveled a lot in third world countries where you get stopped several times a day just for random roadblocks to show your papers. And I mean, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just driving down the road. Show me your papers. It's why I kind of, in a way, I understand DUI checkpoints, but I don't drink and drive, so I understand that some people do, and it's dangerous, and you can kill somebody, and they probably should be off the road. But I get really miffed when I see one, and I turn, because that's just me, because I'm not drinking and driving. So, but just once again, it's just this concern about, because they're doing more than checking you for drinking now. They're asking for your papers, your insurance, that you have proof of insurance. They want to see your driver's license. So, where's the line?
There's always been a conflict in this country between the rights of the individual and the workings of government about the entire, the welfare of ourselves as a collective body. And it started with the Bill of Rights. Ken Paulson made that point earlier. Today, though, when it was just paper, and the government asked you to file an income tax return, and they want to know how much money you made, okay, that's a bit of private information that I'm surrendering to the government, and I'm doing it for a reason that I agree with. Today, there's a lot of ways to get information about people that you don't even have a choice to decide whether or not you release that information or whether or not you agree with how it's going to be used. So I kind of agree that it's a slippery slope, and I think that more and more the public is going to have to take some very stern and direct steps to curtail the collecting of information and how it's used.
All right, thanks. The questioner, I see you over. Thank you very much for that question. I've noticed with my students. But it's we're in the oversharing generation. There's no doubt about that. And we could probably do a panel somewhere along the line just on that question.
Thus the term TMI, right?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Well, thanks for your attention. I hope you found this panel to be as fascinating as I did, that we had access to some real bright minds and some real good thoughts here this afternoon. So thanks to the panelists for sharing, and thanks to everybody for showing up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd also like to thank the Fresno State, the Fresno B, and the Fresno Regional Foundation for setting up this forum today. It's been terrific, and I hope you all come back.
And just an example of that slippery slope, we have cell phones up here. Somebody probably knows we're here.
Oh, thanks.
We got plenty of them over here. You want to?
Okay.
Well, Juan, but right as you started, I did Instagram, tweet, and Facebook a photo of you all. So yeah, people know you're here. Okay, so yes, please join me in giving another round of applause to our amazing panel. Thank you. So we have had quite a day, from our First Amendment history to our fabulous debate to our First Amendment quiz to live music and sandwiches to media and politicians. I hope that you've enjoyed yourself. I also hope you've been a little bit tested, maybe a little challenged, and hopefully you also have kind of grown to appreciate a little more this crazy, wild, difficult First Amendment that we are actually so blessed to have to our advantage. So thank you for being part of the First Amendment celebration. So now, go out and speak your mind and peaceably assemble and freely exercise your religion, petition our government if you have some issues, and then give thanks for freedom of the press. Thank you very much.